Time travel promises freedom, but lurking beneath its wonder are traps that twist logic, erase identities, and shatter free will. These paradoxes aren't just puzzles. They're cracks in the foundation of reality itself. Each one forces us to ask, what happens when cause and effect collapse into each other? And what does that mean for who we are? The Grandfather Paradox, the classic contradiction. Let's start with the granddaddy of all time travel paradoxes, quite literally. The Grandfather Paradox is probably the most famous time travel conundrum, and for good reason. It perfectly encapsulates the fundamental logical problems that arise when we try to change the past, and it does so with a clarity and simplicity that makes the contradiction impossible to ignore. Here's the scenario. Imagine you've invented a time machine and you decide to travel back to the year 1920. Your mission is simple but dark. You want to prevent your grandfather from ever meeting your grandmother. Maybe you have some twisted reason, or maybe you're just conducting an experiment in causality. Whatever your motivation, you succeed. Your grandfather never meets your grandmother, which means your parent is never born, which means you are never born. But wait, if you were never born, then who traveled back in time to prevent your grandparents from meeting? This is where the paradox kicks in. The very act that prevents your existence also prevents the possibility of that act occurring in the first place. It's a logical contradiction so pure and clean that it hurts to think about. Now let's really dig into why this paradox is so devastating to our understanding of causality. In our normal experience of the world, causes precede effects. You flip a light switch, then the light turns on. You drop a ball, then it falls to the ground. This seems so obvious, so fundamental, that we rarely even think about it. But it's actually the foundation of how we understand reality, how we make sense of the world around us, and how we navigate through our daily lives. The concept of causality is so deeply embedded in human cognition that it's almost impossible to imagine a world without it. When a baby drops a toy and it falls to the floor, they're learning about causality. When we plan for the future, we're relying on causal relationships. We work hard because we believe it will cause better outcomes. We eat healthy because we believe it will cause better health. We nurture relationships because we believe it will cause happiness and connection. But the Grandfather Paradox creates what philosophers call a causal loop, a situation where the effect becomes its own cause. Your non-existence causes your non-existence, but your non-existence is also caused by your existence. It's like trying to lift yourself up by pulling on your own shoelaces. The logic simply breaks down, and with it, our entire framework for understanding how reality operates. The paradox becomes even more mind-bending when you start to consider all the variations and implications. What if you don't kill your grandfather, but simply delay his meeting with your grandmother by one day? Would you still be born, but perhaps with slightly different genetics because of the changed timing? What if the delay causes your grandparents to meet in a different location, under different circumstances, leading to a different conversation that influences their relationship in subtle ways? This raises the question of genetic determinism and identity. If your grandfather meets your grandmother one day later, are the sperm and egg that eventually combine to create your parent the same ones that would have combined in the original timeline? The answer is almost certainly no. Sperm cells live for only a few days, and the specific sperm that fertilizes an egg is largely random. A delay of even one day would likely result in a completely different sperm cell fertilizing the egg, creating a genetically different person. But this leads to an even more disturbing realization. If your parent becomes a genetically different person, then you're never born in the way that you were. Even the tiniest change in timing could result in your non-existence, not through dramatic intervention, but through the simple randomness of biological processes. This suggests that your identity is tied not just to major historical events, but to the precise timing of every molecular interaction that led to your existence. The paradox extends infinitely backward through time. What if you prevent your great-great-grandfather from meeting your great-great-grandmother instead? How far back does the causal chain extend? Every generation, every meeting, every choice made by every ancestor potentially affects your eventual existence. The paradox reveals that your existence depends on an impossibly complex web of precisely timed events stretching back through all of human history. Consider the astronomical odds involved. For you to exist exactly as you are, every single one of your ancestors going back thousands of generations had to meet exactly the right person at exactly the right time. If any of these meetings had been delayed by even a day, or if any of these people had made slightly different choices, you would never have been born. Your existence is the result of an unbroken chain of incredibly specific and unlikely events. And here's where it gets really twisted. The paradox applies to any change you make to the past that would prevent your time travel from occurring. If you go back and prevent the invention of the time machine you used to travel back, you've created the same logical contradiction. If you go back and change any event that led to your decision to time travel, perhaps you prevent the traumatic event that motivated your journey, or you alter the sequence of discoveries that led to time travel technology. You've trapped yourself in the same impossible loop. The paradox isn't just about family relationships. It's about the entire causal chain that led to your temporal journey. Every factor that contributed to your ability and desire to travel through time becomes a potential source of paradox. If you change anything that would prevent your time travel from occurring, you create the same logical contradiction as killing your grandfather. Consider this variation. You travel back in time and accidentally step on a butterfly. This small change cascades through history in unpredictable ways, the butterfly effect in action. Perhaps this tiny alteration eventually leads to a world where time travel is never invented. Maybe the death of that butterfly somehow influences the career path of a future scientist who would have discovered time travel, or maybe it subtly changes social and political conditions in ways that prevent the development of the necessary technology. But if time travel is never invented, you could never have traveled back to step on the butterfly in the first place. The butterfly lives. Time travel is invented. You travel back and step on it. Time travel is never invented, and so on forever. This shows how the grandfather paradox extends far beyond just family relationships to encompass any change that affects the conditions necessary for time travel. The grandfather paradox has spawned countless proposed solutions, each more mind-bending than the last. Some scientists suggest that the universe would automatically prevent you from making changes that would create paradoxes, a kind of cosmic protection against logical contradictions. This is sometimes called the Novikov self-consistency principle, named after physicist Igor Novikov. Under this principle, the laws of physics themselves would conspire to prevent paradox-creating events. If you tried to kill your grandfather, your gun would jam. If you tried to prevent your parents from meeting, you would be delayed by traffic or distracted by unexpected events. The universe would become like a cosmic editor, constantly correcting any changes that threaten temporal consistency. But this solution raises its own deeply disturbing questions. If the universe prevents you from creating paradoxes, what happens to your free will? Imagine trying to kill your grandfather and finding that every attempt is thwarted by increasingly improbable coincidences. Your gun misfires, you trip at the crucial moment, a random stranger intervenes, a sudden illness incapacitates you. The list of potential interventions is endless. Are these really coincidences? Or is the universe actively manipulating events to maintain causal consistency? If the latter, then you're not really a free agent making choices. You're a puppet whose strings are being pulled by the fundamental forces of reality. Your sense of free will becomes an elaborate illusion, a cosmic theater in which you think you're the director, but are actually just another actor following a predetermined script. This leads to an even more unsettling possibility. Maybe the entire structure of your life, all your choices and experiences, are shaped by the universe's need to maintain temporal consistency. Maybe you fell in love with your spouse, not because of genuine attraction and compatibility, but because the universe needed you to have children who would eventually develop time travel technology. Maybe your career, your friendships, your entire personality are all carefully orchestrated to ensure that the timeline remains stable. Another proposed solution to the grandfather paradox is the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that changing the past creates alternative timelines rather than altering your original timeline. Under this model, if you go back and prevent your grandparents from meeting, you don't eliminate yourself. You simply create a new timeline where you were never born while continuing to exist as a visitor from the original timeline. This solution appears to resolve the logical contradiction, but it comes with its own psychological and philosophical costs. If every change creates a new timeline, then you can never actually change your own past. Every tragedy you experienced, every loss you suffered, every mistake you made remains permanent and unchangeable. You can create better timelines for alternative versions of people, but you can never improve your own history or undo your own pain. The many-world solution also raises profound questions about identity and the nature of reality. If you prevent your own birth in an alternative timeline, are you a hero who saved the world from your potentially negative influence? Or are you a murderer who eliminated an innocent person? The alternative version of you that never exists might have grown up to cure cancer, write great literature, or contribute to human happiness in ways you can't imagine. Some interpretations suggest that creating a grandfather paradox would result in the time traveler being erased from existence, not just in the future, but retroactively throughout all of time. Under this interpretation, the very act of successful paradox creation would cause the time traveler to have never existed in the first place, eliminating not just their future, but their entire history. But this raises the question of who or what would remember the original timeline. If the time traveler never existed, then no one would remember their original existence or the changes they made. The paradox becomes not just logically impossible, but cognitively impossible. There would be no perspective from which to even recognize that a paradox had occurred. This leads to an even more disturbing possibility. Maybe paradoxes are constantly occurring, but we can never know about them because successful paradoxes erase all evidence of their own occurrence. Maybe reality is constantly being edited by time travelers whose successful interventions eliminate all memory of the original timelines they came from. Consider the implications for personal identity and continuity of self. If you successfully create a grandfather paradox, do you simply cease to exist, or do you continue to exist as a kind of temporal orphan, cut off from your own causal roots? What does it mean to exist without a past? Can someone be real if the events that led to their existence never occurred? Some philosophers argue that the grandfather paradox reveals the fundamental impossibility of time travel. They suggest that the logical contradictions are so severe that they prove time travel cannot exist in our universe. But this may be too hasty a conclusion. The paradox might instead reveal something profound about the nature of causality, time, and reality that we don't yet understand. Perhaps the paradox shows us that our intuitive understanding of time as a linear progression from past to future is just a local approximation of something far more complex. Maybe time is more like a landscape that can be traversed in multiple directions, but with certain paths that are logically forbidden. The grandfather paradox might mark the boundaries of this temporal landscape, showing us where the map of causality breaks down. Another possibility is that the paradox reveals the quantum nature of reality at the macroscopic scale. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in superposition states until they're observed, and the act of observation causes them to collapse into definite states. Maybe time travel creates macroscopic quantum superposition states, where you both exist and do not exist until some kind of cosmic observation collapses the timeline into a consistent state. This quantum interpretation suggests that the grandfather paradox might not be a logical contradiction, but a physical impossibility. The universe might simply refuse to evolve into paradoxical states, just as it refuses to allow particles to travel faster than light or energy to be created from nothing. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of the grandfather paradox is what it suggests about free will and determinism. If you travel back in time with the firm intention of preventing your grandparents from meeting, but the universe somehow prevents you from doing so, do you really have free will? Or are you just a character in a cosmic story that's already been written? The paradox suggests that in a universe where time travel is possible, free will might be an illusion. Not because our actions are predetermined by prior causes, but because they're constrained by the logical requirements of temporal self-consistency. Your choices aren't determined by the past. They're determined by the need to maintain a coherent timeline. This leads to a kind of temporal claustrophobia. Every choice you make, every action you take, must be consistent, not just with the past that led to it, but with all possible futures that might involve time travel back to your present moment. You're not just constrained by causality moving forward in time. You're constrained by causality moving backward from every possible future. But here is an even more disturbing thought. How do you know you're not already trapped in a grandfather paradox scenario? How do you know that your entire family tree is not the result of temporal manipulations designed to maintain causal consistency? Maybe your grandfather met your grandmother not through natural chance, but because some future time traveler needed them to meet to prevent a paradox. Maybe your parents fell in love not because of genuine attraction, but because their relationship was necessary to maintain the timeline. Maybe you yourself are not the product of natural history, but the result of careful temporal engineering designed to ensure that certain events occur or certain paradoxes are avoided. Your entire identity might be an artifact of temporal self-consistency rather than genuine historical development. The grandfather paradox also raises questions about moral responsibility in a time travel scenario. If you attempt to kill your grandfather, but are prevented by the universe's need to maintain consistency, are you guilty of attempted murder? You had the intention and made the attempt, but the crime was physically impossible due to the logical structure of reality. Conversely, if you succeed in creating a paradox and are erased from existence, can you be held responsible for the consequences? If your successful time travel eliminates your own timeline, then the suffering and chaos that might result exist in a reality where you never existed to cause them in the first place. The paradox ultimately reveals that time travel, if possible, would force us to completely reconceptualize our understanding of causality, identity, free will, and moral responsibility. It shows us that the simple, linear relationship between cause and effect that governs our everyday experience might be just a local approximation of something far more complex and strange. The grandfather paradox doesn't just challenge our understanding of time. It challenges our understanding of existence itself. It forces us to confront the possibility that the logical structure of reality might be far more constraining than we ever imagined, that our sense of free will and agency might be carefully orchestrated illusions, and that the very possibility of changing the past might be forever denied to us by the inexorable demands of logical consistency. The grandfather paradox stands as perhaps the clearest example of how time travel would transform not just our ability to move through time, but our entire understanding of what it means to exist, to choose, and to act in a universe where the past is not necessarily fixed and the future is not necessarily unknown. It reveals the profound philosophical depths hidden within what seems like a simple logical puzzle, and it shows us just how much we take for granted about the nature of time, causality, and reality itself. The bootstrap paradox: information without origin. Now let's move on to a paradox that's even more subtle and perhaps more disturbing than the grandfather paradox: the bootstrap paradox. This one doesn't involve preventing your own birth or killing anyone. Instead, it deals with something seemingly harmless: information. But as we'll see, this makes it no less devastating to our understanding of reality, and in some ways, even more unsettling, because it strikes at the heart of creativity, knowledge, and human achievement. Picture this scenario. You're a huge fan of Shakespeare, and you've just finished reading Hamlet for the 100th time. You know every line, every nuance of the play, every subtle meaning and hidden reference. The work has shaped your understanding of literature, philosophy, and the human condition. You can recite entire soliloquies from memory. You understand the intricate wordplay and double meanings. You've analyzed every character's motivation and every plot twist. The play isn't just entertainment for you, it's become part of your intellectual DNA. Then, you get access to a time machine, and you decide to travel back to meet the great William Shakespeare himself. This isn't just tourist curiosity. You want to discuss the deeper meanings of his work with the master, to understand his creative process, to perhaps witness genius in action. When you arrive in Elizabethan England and introduce yourself to the young playwright, you discover something shocking. He's never heard of Hamlet. The play that you consider his masterpiece, the work that has influenced centuries of literature and thought, the piece of art that has been analyzed by scholars, performed by actors, and cherished by millions of readers. It doesn't exist. Shakespeare is still struggling with his early works, still finding his voice as a writer, still years away from the creative peak that produced his greatest tragedies. Being the helpful time traveler you are, and not wanting to deprive the world of this literary masterpiece, you decide to share this work with its supposed author. You recite the entire play from memory, every line, every stage direction, every subtle wordplay and metaphor. To be or not to be? That is the question. You begin, and you watch as Shakespeare's eyes widen with recognition of the brilliance of the words. Shakespeare, impressed by the genius of the work and perhaps a bit envious that he didn't think of it himself, writes it down carefully. He captures every nuance, every character development, every philosophical insight you've shared with him. He polishes it slightly, adds his own theatrical touches, and later publishes it as his own creation. The play becomes a massive success, just as history recorded. Critics praise its psychological depth, audiences are moved by its existential questions, and scholars begin the centuries-long process of analyzing its meanings. Here's the mind-bending question that haunts this scenario. Who actually wrote Hamlet? You learned it from Shakespeare, but Shakespeare learned it from you. The information, the actual creative content of the play, has no origin point. It exists in a closed loop through time, with no beginning and no end. The greatest work in the English language suddenly becomes an orphan, a creation without a creator, a masterpiece that seems to have written itself. This is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. Information, ideas, or objects become trapped in causal loops, existing without ever being created. The paradox reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of creativity, originality, and the flow of information through time. But let's dig deeper into why this paradox is so philosophically troubling. In our normal understanding of the world, information has to come from somewhere. Every idea, every piece of knowledge, every creative work has an origin story. Someone, somewhere, at some point, had to be the first to think of it, create it, discover it. That's how we understand human creativity and the progress of knowledge. Think about the process of writing. When an author sits down to create a story, they draw on their experiences, their knowledge, their imagination. They combine existing elements in new ways. They explore themes and ideas. They wrestle with language and meaning. The creative process is a transformation. The author takes raw material from their life and mind and transforms it into something new. Even when authors are influenced by other works, they're adding their own perspective, their own voice, their own creative contribution. Or consider how Hamlet might have been created in our timeline. Shakespeare drew on earlier plays about the same legendary Danish prince, but he transformed the story completely. He added psychological complexity to the characters, philosophical depth to the plot, and poetic language that elevated the material far beyond its sources. He took existing elements, revenge stories, court intrigue, supernatural visitations, and combined them in ways that created something genuinely new and original. The bootstrap paradox completely undermines this understanding. It suggests that information can exist without ever being created, that effects can exist without causes, that something can come from nothing. This isn't just a violation of our intuitive understanding of causality. It's a violation of some of our deepest assumptions about the nature of existence itself. Consider the philosophical implications. If information can exist without being created, what does that say about human creativity? Are we really creating new ideas, or are we just discovering ideas that already exist in some timeless realm? The bootstrap paradox makes the ancient philosophical question of whether mathematical truths are discovered or invented even more complex and urgent. In mathematics, there's an ongoing debate about whether mathematical truths exist independently of human minds. Platonists argue that numbers, geometric relationships, and mathematical theorems exist in some eternal, unchanging realm, and mathematicians simply discover these pre-existing truths. When a mathematician proves that the square root of 2 is irrational, they're not creating this fact. They're uncovering a truth that has always existed. Formalists, on the other hand, argue that mathematics is a human creation, a set of symbols and rules that we've invented to help us understand and manipulate the world. Mathematical truths aren't discovered. They're constructed through human reasoning and creativity. The square root of 2 isn't inherently irrational. It's irrational within the mathematical system we've created. The bootstrap paradox throws this debate into chaos. If mathematical theorems can exist in causal loops, then they seem to support the Platonist view. The theorems exist independently of any human mind that might discover or prove them. But they also seem to undermine it because they suggest that mathematical truths might not be eternal and unchanging, but rather contingent on the existence of causal loops through time. Imagine a mathematician who receives a complete proof of a famous unsolved theorem from their future self. They publish the proof and receive great acclaim for their discovery. Years later, they use time travel to send the proof back to their younger self. The mathematical knowledge exists in a perfect loop. It was never actually discovered or created by human intelligence, but it's also not a pre-existing truth waiting to be found. It's something else entirely. Information that bootstraps itself into existence through temporal loops. The paradox becomes even more disturbing when you consider its potential applications. Imagine traveling back in time with the complete plans for advanced technology. Let's say a computer chip design from the year 2050. You give these plans to engineers in the year 2020, who then develop the technology, refine it, and eventually create the manufacturing processes that lead to the production of the very chip design you brought back from 2050. The technology has no origin point. It was never actually invented by anyone. No human mind struggled with the engineering challenges. No researcher had the breakthrough insights. No team of scientists worked through the theoretical problems. The technology simply exists in a causal loop, appearing to create itself through the mechanism of time travel. This raises profound questions about intellectual property, scientific progress, and the nature of discovery itself. If technologies can exist in causal loops, what does that mean for human innovation? Are we creating progress, or are we just playing out predetermined patterns that have no beginning? Does the concept of invention become meaningless in a universe where information can bootstrap itself into existence? Consider the implications for scientific research. Much of science is built on the idea of incremental progress. Researchers build on the work of their predecessors, gradually expanding the boundaries of human knowledge. Each discovery enables new discoveries. Each breakthrough opens new avenues of investigation. The history of science is often told as a story of human curiosity, intelligence, and perseverance gradually uncovering the secrets of the universe. But if information can exist in temporal loops, this entire model breaks down. Imagine a scientist who receives the complete solution to a fundamental physics problem from the future. They publish the solution, which enables new technologies and new research directions. Eventually, this leads to the development of time travel, which allows the solution to be sent back to the original scientist. The knowledge exists in a perfect loop with no moment of actual discovery or insight. This scenario is particularly unsettling because it suggests that human intelligence and creativity might be unnecessary for scientific progress. If knowledge can circulate through temporal loops, then the hard work of research, experimentation, and theoretical development becomes irrelevant. The greatest scientific discoveries might just be information borrowed from the future rather than achievements of human intellect and perseverance. The bootstrap paradox also has profound implications for education and learning. If a teacher receives complete knowledge of a subject from their future self and then teaches it to students, who did the learning? The teacher never actually learned the material in the traditional sense. They just received it fully formed. The students learn from the teacher, but the teacher's knowledge has no origin. This extends to all forms of knowledge transmission. If historical facts can exist in bootstrap loops, then our understanding of history might be based on information that has no original source. If scientific theories can loop through time, then our models of how the universe works might be self-validating fictions, rather than discoveries about objective reality. The paradox becomes even more complex when you consider artistic and creative works. Imagine a musician who travels back in time with a beautiful symphony from the future. They perform it in the past. It becomes famous and influences other composers, and eventually, through a chain of musical development, it leads to the composition of the very symphony they brought back. Who composed the music? The future composer learned it from the musical tradition that was influenced by the time traveler's performance, but the time traveler got it from that future composer. The creative content exists without a creator, beauty exists without an artist, and human creativity becomes irrelevant to the production of art. This has disturbing implications for the very concept of human achievement. If the greatest works of art, literature, and music can exist in causal loops, then what we think of as the pinnacles of human creativity might just be information circulating through time. Shakespeare didn't write Hamlet, Beethoven didn't compose his symphonies, Michelangelo didn't paint the Sistine Chapel. They were all just links in temporal chains that have no beginning and no end. Some physicists and philosophers have tried to resolve the bootstrap paradox by arguing that information can't actually exist without origin, that the universe has some kind of built-in mechanism for preventing these informational loops. They suggest that attempts to create bootstrap paradoxes would fail, perhaps through quantum mechanical effects or through some deeper principle of physics we don't yet understand. One proposed mechanism is based on the quantum nature of information. In quantum mechanics, information is subject to various conservation laws and fundamental limits. Some physicists argue that these quantum constraints would prevent information from existing in perfect causal loops. The act of transmitting information through time might necessarily degrade or alter it, preventing true bootstrap paradoxes from forming. But this solution raises its own questions about the nature of reality and whether true time travel is possible at all. If the universe prevents informational paradoxes, it must have some way of distinguishing between original information and looped information. This implies a kind of cosmic bookkeeping system that tracks the origins of every piece of information in the universe. How would such a system work? Would it require some kind of universal database that records the causal history of every fact, every idea, every piece of knowledge? Would it need to monitor every information transfer to ensure that no causal loops are created? The computational requirements for such a system seem impossibly vast, perhaps requiring more information storage than exists in the entire universe. Others suggest that the paradox reveals something fundamental about the nature of information itself. Maybe information, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. Under this interpretation, the bootstrap paradox isn't a problem to be solved, but a feature of how information actually works in a universe where time travel is possible. This view is supported by some interpretations of quantum mechanics, which suggest that information is a fundamental property of reality, as basic as matter and energy. If information is truly fundamental, then perhaps it can exist in causal loops without violating any deep principles of physics. The appearance of information without origin might just be our limited perspective on a more complex informational structure that exists outside of linear time. But this raises its own disturbing questions. If information can exist in temporal loops, what distinguishes real knowledge from fictional knowledge? If a false theory can be sustained by a bootstrap paradox, how do we distinguish between truth and self-consistent fiction? The paradox threatens not just our understanding of creativity and discovery, but our entire epistemological framework, our system for determining what we can know and how we can know it. Consider this variation. Someone travels back in time with a completely false scientific theory, perhaps a complex but incorrect model of how gravity works. They present this theory to scientists in the past who accept it and build their research around it. Over time, this false theory influences the development of technology and scientific thinking, eventually leading to the creation of time travel technology based on incorrect principles. But the time travel technology works, even though it's based on false premises. The false theory becomes self-validating through its causal loop. It's true not because it accurately describes reality, but because it creates a consistent temporal loop. The distinction between truth and fiction breaks down when information can bootstrap itself through time. The most unsettling aspect of the bootstrap paradox might be its implications for consciousness and identity. If you can carry information back in time, what about memories? What about personality traits? What about the very content of your consciousness? Could your thoughts and experiences become trapped in bootstrap loops, existing without ever being originally experienced? Imagine traveling back in time and sharing a profound personal insight with your younger self. Perhaps a moment of understanding about love, loss, or the meaning of life. Your younger self is deeply moved by this wisdom and carries it with them throughout their life. Eventually, this insight shapes who they become, and when they get the opportunity to travel back in time, they share the same wisdom with their younger self. The insight exists in a temporal loop, but who originally had the experience that led to the wisdom? If your most profound understanding of life comes from your future self, and your future self's understanding comes from your past self, then where did the wisdom originate? Are you experiencing your own life, or are you just playing out a predetermined script that has no author? This raises disturbing questions about the authenticity of personal experience and the continuity of consciousness. If your deepest insights, your most meaningful memories, your fundamental understanding of yourself and the world can all exist in bootstrap loops, then what makes you uniquely you? Are you a genuine person having authentic experiences, or are you just a collection of information patterns circulating through temporal loops? The bootstrap paradox also has implications for moral and ethical development. If your understanding of right and wrong comes from your future self, and your future self's morality comes from your past self, then ethical knowledge exists without foundation. Moral truths become arbitrary patterns sustained by temporal loops rather than genuine insights about how we should live. This extends to all forms of personal growth and development. If your knowledge of how to be a good parent comes from your future self, if your understanding of how to maintain relationships comes from temporal loops, if your professional skills and personal wisdom all exist without origin, then human development becomes a hollow facade. You appear to grow and learn, but you're actually just cycling through information patterns that have no source. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that bootstrap paradoxes are already occurring all around us, but we can never detect them. If information can loop through time without leaving any trace of its temporal origins, then our entire knowledge base might be filled with facts, theories, and ideas that exist without creation. Maybe some of our greatest scientific discoveries are just information borrowed from the future. Maybe some of our most cherished cultural works are temporal artifacts rather than human achievements. Maybe the very concepts and ideas we use to understand reality are themselves products of causal loops that began nowhere and will end nowhere. The bootstrap paradox ultimately forces us to question the nature of knowledge, creativity, and human achievement. It suggests that in a universe where time travel is possible, the concepts of discovery, invention, and original thought might become meaningless. It reveals that our understanding of information and causality might be far more limited than we realize, and it opens up the terrifying possibility that the very foundations of human knowledge and culture might be built on temporal quicksand. Patterns of information that seem solid and real, but actually exist without any ultimate foundation. The bootstrap paradox stands as perhaps the most philosophically challenging of all time travel paradoxes. While the grandfather paradox threatens our understanding of causality and existence, the bootstrap paradox threatens our understanding of knowledge, creativity, and the very possibility of genuine human achievement. It suggests that in a universe where information can bootstrap itself into existence, the line between truth and fiction, between discovery and hallucination, between genuine creativity and elaborate illusion, might disappear entirely. The predestination paradox, the futility of fighting fate. Let's move on to one of the most psychologically disturbing time travel paradoxes, the predestination paradox. This one is particularly unsettling because it strips away our sense of agency and free will in the most elegant and cruel way possible. Unlike other paradoxes that create logical contradictions, the predestination paradox is perfectly logically consistent. And that's exactly what makes it so terrifying. Here's how it works. You're a history student in the year 2050, and you're reading about a terrible disaster that occurred in 2025. A building collapsed during a crowded event, killing hundreds of people. The historical records are unusually detailed about this tragedy, describing not just the collapse itself, but also its cause. According to multiple historical sources, the disaster was caused by a time traveler who, in attempting to prevent the collapse, accidentally triggered the very structural failures that brought the building down. The records describe this time traveler in detail: their appearance, their actions, their well-intentioned but misguided efforts to save lives. Witnesses reported seeing someone who clearly didn't belong to the time period, someone who seemed to have advanced knowledge of the impending disaster. This person was seen frantically trying to evacuate the building, arguing with security guards, and making desperate attempts to warn people about structural problems they claimed to have insider knowledge about. Being a compassionate person with access to time travel technology, you decide to travel back to 2025 to prevent this disaster. You've studied the historical records carefully. You know exactly what went wrong, and you're determined not to be the bumbling time traveler who causes the disaster. You're going to be smarter, more careful, more thoughtful than whoever that person was. You'll prevent the collapse without causing it yourself. You arrive a few days before the scheduled collapse and begin investigating. You're methodical in your approach, using your knowledge of the future to identify potential problems. You examine the building's structure, looking for signs of weakness or instability. You research the event that's supposed to take place, analyzing crowd flow patterns and safety protocols. You prepare multiple contingency plans for different scenarios. Your first instinct is to simply call in an anonymous bomb threat to evacuate the building. But as you research the historical records more carefully, you realize that such a call was made. And it's part of what caused the panic that led to the stampede and structural failure. The bomb threat created chaos instead of orderly evacuation. So you decide to take a more subtle approach. You pose as a building inspector and speak to the real inspectors, suggesting they examine specific structural elements you know will fail. But your well-intentioned warnings lead them to conduct stress tests that weaken the already compromised support beams. Their invasive inspections, guided by your expert knowledge, create the very stress fractures that will cause the collapse. Realizing your mistake, you try a different approach. You contact event organizers, warning them about potential safety issues without revealing your true identity or the source of your knowledge. You suggest reducing the maximum occupancy, changing the event layout, or implementing additional safety measures. But your warnings create anxiety among the organizers, leading them to hire additional security and implement crowd control measures that actually make the situation worse. The extra barriers and checkpoints you inspire create bottlenecks and confusion that contribute to the deadly stampede. As the day of the disaster approaches, you become increasingly desperate. Every attempt you make to prevent the collapse seems to contribute to causing it. You try to disrupt the event entirely, hoping that if fewer people attend, fewer will die. But your efforts to sabotage ticket sales and spread negative publicity only ensure that the people who do attend are packed more densely into the available space. Finally, in desperation, you decide to physically intervene on the day of the collapse. You position yourself in the building and try to guide people away from the areas you know will be most dangerous. But your presence creates confusion and panic. People don't understand why you are trying to evacuate them from what appears to be a safe building during a peaceful event. Security guards try to remove you, creating a disturbance that draws attention and crowds. As chaos erupts around you, you realize with horror that you are the time traveler mentioned in the historical records. Your attempts to change history didn't change anything. They fulfilled it. You weren't fighting against fate. You were its unwitting agent. Every action you took, every well-intentioned intervention you made, contributed to the very disaster you were trying to prevent. The building collapses exactly as history recorded, and hundreds of people die exactly as the records described. The witnesses who reported seeing a time traveler were seeing you. The person whose misguided interventions caused the disaster was you. You have become the very thing you set out to stop, trapped in a perfect closed loop of causality, where trying to prevent a tragedy ensures that it occurs. This is the predestination paradox, and it's perhaps the most philosophically devastating of all time travel paradoxes, because it appears to solve the logical problems of other paradoxes while creating an even deeper problem: the complete elimination of free will. Unlike the grandfather paradox, which creates logical contradictions, the predestination paradox is perfectly logically consistent. There's no violation of causality, no impossible loops of cause and effect. The timeline remains stable and unchanged. Your actions in the past are exactly what the historical record said they would be. Everything happens exactly as it was always supposed to happen. The problem is that this stability comes at the cost of human agency. In a universe governed by predestination paradoxes, free will becomes an elaborate illusion. You think you're making choices, but those choices were always destined to be made. You think you're trying to change the future, but you're actually just playing out a predetermined script. Your sense of agency, your feeling that your decisions matter, becomes nothing more than a cruel cosmic joke. The psychological horror of the predestination paradox goes even deeper when you consider its implications for moral responsibility. In the building collapse scenario, hundreds of people died as a result of your actions. But those actions were predetermined by the very historical records that motivated you to travel back in time. You caused the disaster, but only because you read about yourself causing the disaster, which made it necessary for you to travel back and cause the disaster. Are you really to blame for deaths that were always going to happen? Or are you just another victim of a deterministic universe? The traditional concepts of guilt and innocence, responsibility and blame, become meaningless when every action is both caused by and the cause of itself. You're simultaneously the perpetrator and the victim of the same crime. This raises profound questions about justice and punishment. If someone commits a crime that was predetermined by temporal loops, should they be held accountable? How do you punish someone for actions they were destined to perform? The entire foundation of moral and legal responsibility crumbles when free will disappears, when every choice becomes an inevitable consequence of information flowing backward through time. But here's where the paradox becomes truly mind-bending. How do you know whether you're in a predestination scenario or not? Every time you try to change something, you might actually be fulfilling a predetermined outcome. Every choice you make might be the choice you were always destined to make. There's no way to step outside the system and observe it objectively because you are part of the system. This creates a kind of temporal paranoia. Maybe your decision to have coffee this morning was predetermined by some future event you're not aware of. Maybe your choice of words in conversation is fulfilling some destiny that stretches across decades. Maybe every moment of your life is just playing out a script written in the structure of space-time itself, and your sense of making decisions is just the subjective experience of a deterministic process unfolding. Consider this variation of the paradox. You receive a message from the future warning you about a specific mistake you're going to make next Tuesday. The message describes your future actions in detail, where you'll be, what you'll do, what will go wrong, and what the consequences will be. It's signed by your future self and contains enough personal details to convince you of its authenticity. Determined to prove your free will, you decide to do the opposite of what the message predicts. If it says you'll go to work, you'll stay home. If it says you'll make a certain decision, you'll make the opposite decision. You'll show that the future is not fixed, that you have genuine agency, that you can defy destiny through the power of conscious choice. But what if the message was sent by someone who knew you would react this way? What if your rebellion was itself predicted and accounted for? What if the person who sent the message knew that warning you about the mistake would cause you to make a different mistake? One that's even worse than the original? You think you're asserting your free will by defying the prediction, but you might actually be fulfilling a more complex prediction that accounted for your defiant response. You're trapped in an ever-expanding web of predetermined reactions to predetermined predictions, each layer of rebellion becoming another link in a chain of destiny that binds you more tightly the more you struggle against it. The predestination paradox also raises disturbing questions about the nature of knowledge and prophecy. If someone can accurately predict the future, what does that say about the nature of time itself? Are future events already fixed and determined, just waiting to unfold like frames in a movie reel? Or does the act of observation itself somehow create the reality being observed? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that observation plays a fundamental role in determining reality, that the act of measurement actually causes quantum systems to collapse into definite states. But the predestination paradox seems to suggest the opposite, that reality is already determined, and our observations are just playing catch-up with events that are already fixed in the fabric of space-time. This leads to a disturbing view of consciousness and experience. If the future is predetermined, then your thoughts, feelings, and decisions are just elaborate illusions. Your sense of deliberation, your feeling that you're weighing options and making choices, becomes nothing more than a complex puppet show. You think you're the puppet master, but you're actually just another puppet whose strings are being pulled by the deterministic laws of the universe. The paradox becomes even more disturbing when you consider its implications for personal relationships and human connection. Imagine traveling back in time and meeting your future spouse in the past, only to discover that your relationship was described in historical records from the future. Were your feelings genuine, or were you just acting out a script? Did you choose to love this person, or were you programmed by destiny to have these emotions? Every moment of intimacy, every shared experience, every expression of love becomes suspect when free will disappears. Are you really connecting with another human being? Or are you just two algorithms executing predetermined routines? The most meaningful and personal aspects of human experience become hollow when reduced to inevitable consequences of temporal loops. Consider the implications for children and family relationships. If you have children in a predestined timeline, did you choose to create new life? Or were those children always destined to exist? Are you really a parent making decisions about how to raise and care for your children? Or are you just following a script that determines every aspect of their development? The profound responsibility and deep emotional connection of parenthood becomes meaningless when every choice is predetermined. The predestination paradox also has implications for personal growth and self-improvement. If your future actions are predetermined, what's the point of trying to become a better person? Why struggle against your flaws and weaknesses if your future behavior is already fixed? Every attempt at self-improvement becomes meaningless when you know that your future self already exists in a predetermined state. But this raises a deeper paradox within the paradox. If the knowledge that your future is predetermined causes you to stop trying to improve yourself, and if that surrender to determinism is itself part of what was predetermined, then your fatalistic response becomes another link in the causal chain. You can't escape predestination by accepting it because your acceptance was itself predestined. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the predestination paradox is that it makes every time travel story a tragedy. The time traveler always thinks they have agency, always believes they can change things, but they're actually just puppets in a cosmic play that was written long before they were born. Their heroic intentions become cruel ironies. Their desperate attempts to help become mechanisms of harm. Their every action becomes proof of their own powerlessness. Consider the psychological state of someone who becomes aware that they're trapped in a predestination scenario. They know that their future actions are predetermined, but they still feel like they're making choices. They experience the full emotional weight of decision-making while knowing that their decisions don't actually matter. They feel responsible for their actions while understanding that responsibility is an illusion. This creates a unique form of existential despair. It's not just that life is meaningless, it's that the feeling of meaning is a deliberate deception built into the structure of reality. You experience purpose, agency, and moral weight while knowing that these experiences are fundamentally false. You're forced to live as if your choices matter while knowing they don't, creating a kind of conscious schizophrenia between experience and understanding. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of suffering and evil. If all events are predetermined, then suffering serves no purpose. It's not a test of character, it's not an opportunity for growth, it's not even a consequence of bad choices. It's just an inevitable feature of a deterministic universe. Evil actions aren't moral failures. They're just necessary components of a predetermined timeline. This strips suffering of any meaning or purpose. The pain experienced by the victims of the building collapse in our example isn't tragic in any meaningful sense. It's just an inevitable outcome that was always going to occur. Their deaths don't represent a moral failure or a preventable tragedy. They're just data points in a predetermined sequence of events. But perhaps most disturbing is what the predestination paradox suggests about consciousness itself. If your thoughts and decisions are predetermined, then consciousness becomes purely epiphenomenal. It exists, but it doesn't actually do anything. You experience making decisions, but those decisions are actually made by the deterministic structure of the universe. Your consciousness is just along for the ride, a passenger in a vehicle it thinks it's driving. This raises the terrifying possibility that consciousness is just a cruel joke played by the universe on itself. We experience agency, purpose, and meaning, but these experiences are just illusions generated by deterministic processes. We think we're living meaningful lives, but we're actually just biochemical machines playing out predetermined routines while hallucinating that we have free will. Some proposed solutions to the predestination paradox are almost as disturbing as the paradox itself. One suggestion is that the universe has a kind of built-in ethical optimization system that ensures predetermined outcomes are always morally optimal. Under this view, if you're destined to cause a disaster, it's because that disaster prevents an even worse outcome that you're not aware of. This solution transforms the cosmos into a kind of utilitarian calculator, making moral judgments on a scale that individual humans cannot comprehend. The building collapse that kills hundreds might prevent a war that would kill millions. Your predetermined actions, no matter how terrible they seem, are actually part of a cosmic plan that optimizes for the greatest good. But this raises its own disturbing questions. Who or what determines what's morally optimal? What gives the universe the right to sacrifice some people for the greater good? If the universe is making moral calculations, does it have consciousness, intentions, and values? And if so, whose values are built into the structure of reality? Another proposed solution is even more unsettling. Perhaps the predestination paradox reveals that in a universe with time travel, traditional concepts of good and evil become meaningless. Maybe moral responsibility disappears when cause and effect become circular. Maybe ethics itself is just a temporary illusion that breaks down when you can travel through time. This view suggests that time travel doesn't just change the physical laws of the universe, it changes the moral laws as well. Actions that would be clearly right or wrong in a linear timeline become morally neutral when they're part of predestined loops. Murder becomes no different from charity. Love becomes no different from hatred, because all actions are equally predetermined and equally meaningless. Yet another interpretation suggests that predestination paradoxes reveal the quantum nature of free will. Just as quantum mechanics shows that particles can exist in superposition states until observed, maybe free will exists in a superposition of determined and undetermined states, until the timeline is observed from the perspective of time travel. Under this view, your actions are simultaneously free and determined until someone travels back from the future to observe them. The act of temporal observation collapses the quantum superposition of possibilities into a single determined outcome. You have free will right up until the moment someone looks back at your choices from the future, at which point your decisions become fixed and predetermined. This creates a deeply unsettling relationship between knowledge and freedom. The more the future knows about your present choices, the less free those choices become. Time travel doesn't just allow observation of predetermined events, it actually creates predetermination through the act of observation itself. The predestination paradox ultimately forces us to confront some of the deepest questions about human existence. Do we really have free will? Are we truly responsible for our actions? Is the sense of agency that seems so fundamental to human experience actually an elaborate illusion? The paradox suggests that time travel wouldn't just allow us to visit the past and future. It would reveal that past, present, and future are all equally fixed and predetermined. The predestination paradox stands as perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all time travel paradoxes. While other paradoxes threaten our understanding of logic and causality, the predestination paradox threatens our understanding of ourselves. It suggests that consciousness might be nothing more than the universe's way of experiencing its own deterministic unfolding, that free will might be nothing more than the feeling of inevitability from the inside, and that the entire human experience of choice, responsibility, and moral agency might be the most elaborate and cruel illusion ever devised by the laws of physics. The Hitler paradox, the endless loop of moral choice. Now we come to one of the most morally complex and psychologically disturbing paradoxes in the entire catalog of time travel conundrums: the Hitler paradox. This paradox combines the logical problems of causality with profound moral questions about the nature of evil, good, and human responsibility. It's a paradox that almost everyone who has ever considered time travel has thought about at some point, and it reveals just how complicated moral decision-making becomes when linear time breaks down. The setup is deceptively simple, and it's one that appeals to our most basic moral intuitions. You have access to a time machine, and you decide to use it for what seems like an unquestionably moral purpose: preventing the Holocaust by killing Adolf Hitler before he rises to power. Maybe you travel back to 1905 and eliminate him as a young art student in Vienna, struggling with poverty and rejection from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Or perhaps you go back to 1920 when he's still a minor political agitator in Munich, ranting to small crowds in beer halls about Germany's humiliation in World War I. The moral case seems clear-cut. By eliminating Hitler, you prevent the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the deaths of millions more in concentration camps, the global catastrophe of World War II that killed over 70 million people, and countless other atrocities. It's a simple utilitarian calculation. One death prevents millions of deaths. The moral mathematics seems overwhelming in favor of action. You succeed in your mission. Hitler dies young, never rises to power, never implements the final solution. The Holocaust never happens. World War II takes a different course. Perhaps it never happens at all. And millions of lives are saved. You return to your own time as humanity's greatest unsung hero, the person who prevented the 20th century's greatest evil. But here's where the paradox kicks in. If the Holocaust never happened, you never develop the motivation to travel back and kill Hitler. Without the historical knowledge of his atrocities, why would you single out this particular failed Austrian artist for assassination? In a timeline where Hitler died young and obscure, he's just another casualty of poverty, disease, or random violence. There's nothing to distinguish him from millions of other people who died young in early 20th century Europe. So, Hitler lives, rises to power, commits his crimes, and creates the historical conditions that motivate you to travel back and kill him. This creates what appears to be an endless causal loop. Hitler's atrocities motivate his own prevention, but preventing him eliminates the motivation for his prevention, which allows his atrocities to occur, which motivates his prevention, and so on, forever. But the Hitler paradox is more than just a logical puzzle. It's a moral maze that becomes more disturbing the deeper you venture into it. Let's explore some of the ethical implications that make this paradox particularly haunting and complex. First, there's the question of moral certainty and the ethics of preemptive action. In our timeline, we know Hitler became one of history's greatest monsters. We have overwhelming evidence of his crimes, detailed records of his decisions, testimonies from survivors and perpetrators, and clear documentation of the suffering he caused. The historical record is unambiguous about his responsibility for unprecedented evil. But what about the baby Hitler you're considering killing? Or the young art student? Or the struggling political activist? That person hasn't committed any crimes yet. They're innocent of everything except the potential for future evil. The baby Hitler crying in his crib in 1889 has never harmed anyone. The young man being rejected by art school in 1907 is just another disappointed dreamer. The political agitator in 1920 is just one of many radical voices in a chaotic post-war society. Is it morally justifiable to kill an innocent person based on future crimes they haven't yet committed and might never commit in the new timeline you're creating? This transforms the time traveler into a kind of temporal judge, jury, and executioner, making life and death decisions based on events that exist only in an alternative timeline. You're essentially punishing someone for crimes committed by a different version of themselves in a different reality. The moral weight of this decision becomes even heavier when you consider that the young Hitler you might kill could potentially grow up to be a different person entirely. People change, circumstances vary, and the conditions that created the historical Hitler might not exist in your new timeline. character is not fixed at birth. It's shaped by experiences, choices, and circumstances. The shy, artistic young man who failed to get into art school might, under different conditions, become a mediocre painter, a successful architect, or even a force for good in the world. Maybe without World War I's specific aftermath, without the particular economic conditions of 1920s Germany, without the specific social and political circumstances that enabled his rise, this alternative Hitler becomes something entirely different. Perhaps he channels his passion for grand architecture into designing beautiful buildings instead of planning genocides. Perhaps his gift for public speaking leads him to become a reformer rather than a dictator. Perhaps his early experiences with poverty and rejection make him more, not less, sympathetic to human suffering. This uncertainty about character and destiny raises profound questions about moral responsibility and the nature of evil. Are people inherently evil, or are they made evil by circumstances? If Hitler's evil was contingent on specific historical conditions, then killing him becomes not just morally questionable, but potentially unnecessary. The evil you're trying to prevent might never have emerged in the altered timeline anyway. Then there's the butterfly effect problem, which adds layers of moral complexity to an already impossible decision. Even if you successfully kill Hitler and prevent his specific atrocities, what about the larger conditions that allowed his rise to power? The economic devastation of Germany after World War I, the resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, the social and political instability of the Weimar Republic, the underlying currents of anti-Semitism and nationalism that existed throughout Europe. All of these factors would still exist in your altered timeline. Without Hitler, would someone else have filled the same role? History is full of examples where the removal of one leader simply created space for another, sometimes worse leader to emerge. The conditions that enabled Hitler's rise, economic desperation, political instability, widespread resentment, and existing prejudices, don't disappear with his death. They remain as potential fuel for other demagogues and dictators. Consider this chilling variation. What if Hitler's early death leads to a more competent Nazi leader taking power? Hitler, for all his evil, was also incompetent in many ways. His strategic decisions during World War II were often disastrous for Germany. His ideology, while horrific, was also internally contradictory and ultimately self-defeating. What if his removal allows someone more intelligent, more strategically brilliant, and more ruthless to take his place? Imagine if Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and the Holocaust, had risen to power instead. Or what if someone like Reinhard Heydrich, the brilliant and utterly ruthless butcher of Prague, had become the leader of Nazi Germany? These men combined Hitler's evil with greater competence and strategic thinking. Under their leadership, Nazi Germany might have been more successful, more efficient in its genocides, and more likely to win World War II. Or consider an even more disturbing possibility. What if Hitler's death creates conditions for a communist revolution in Germany, leading to a Stalin-like figure taking control? Stalin killed even more people than Hitler, and a German Stalin with access to advanced German technology and industry might have been even more devastating to human civilization. The moral calculus becomes impossibly complex when you realize that preventing one evil might enable a greater one. This leads to one of the most troubling aspects of the Hitler paradox, the possibility that Hitler's evil, however horrific, might have been a necessary evil that prevented even greater atrocities. This is not to minimize or justify the Holocaust, but to recognize that history is complex and interconnected in ways that make simple moral judgments dangerous. For example, the defeat of Nazi Germany led to significant advances in human rights, international law, and global cooperation. The horror of the Holocaust contributed to the establishment of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international laws against genocide. The world's revulsion at Nazi atrocities helped delegitimize racism and anti-Semitism in ways that might not have happened otherwise. Without the stark example of Nazi evil, would humanity have developed the same commitment to human rights and international justice? Would the civil rights movement have succeeded as it did without the moral clarity provided by the contrast with Nazi ideology? Would the State of Israel have been established, providing a homeland for Jewish survivors and refugees? These questions don't justify the Holocaust, but they illustrate how even the most evil events can have complex and unintended consequences that must be weighed in any moral calculation about changing the past. The Hitler paradox also raises profound questions about historical responsibility and the role of individual actors in shaping events. How much of the Holocaust was due to Hitler personally, and how much was due to broader social, economic, and political forces? If you remove Hitler, but leave all the underlying conditions unchanged, you might just be treating the symptom while ignoring the disease. Antisemitism existed in Europe for centuries before Hitler. Economic nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism were widespread in early 20th century Europe. The technology and bureaucratic systems that enabled the Holocaust would still exist in your altered timeline. The question becomes, was Hitler the cause of these atrocities, or was he just the particular individual who happened to implement them? This leads to an even more disturbing possibility. What if killing Hitler doesn't prevent the Holocaust at all, but simply changes who carries it out and how it's implemented? What if the systematic murder of European Jews was an inevitable result of the social and political conditions of the time, and Hitler was just the particular individual who happened to be in position to implement it? Under this interpretation, removing Hitler might change the details of the genocide. Different camps, different methods, different timelines, but not prevent it entirely. The underlying hatred, the bureaucratic systems, the economic incentives, the political pressures that enabled the Holocaust would all still exist. Someone else would step into the role of implementing these policies, perhaps with different rhetoric, but similar results. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of the Hitler paradox is what it reveals about the nature of moral action in a universe where time travel is possible. In our normal understanding of ethics, we judge actions based on their intentions and their actual consequences. A person who tries to save lives and succeeds is a hero. A person who tries to cause harm and succeeds is a villain. The moral status of actions is determined by what people intend to accomplish and what they actually accomplish. But time travel creates situations where good intentions lead to the very outcomes they were trying to prevent, where attempts to reduce suffering increase suffering, where moral actions become immoral through the mechanisms of temporal causality. Every attempt to create good might loop back on itself, creating the conditions for evil. Every moral choice might be trapped in an endless cycle of cause and effect, where preventing suffering creates the circumstances that cause suffering. This leads to a kind of temporal moral paralysis. If any intervention might trigger unintended consequences, if every attempt to improve the past might make it worse, what's the ethical response? Is it more moral to act and risk making things worse, or to refrain from acting and allow known atrocities to occur? Consider this moral dilemma. If you know that attempting to kill Hitler will trap you in a causal loop where your failure to kill him is what enables his rise to power, do you have a moral obligation to attempt the assassination anyway? Your attempt will fail, and your failure will cause the Holocaust, but not attempting would also cause the Holocaust. You're damned if you do, and damned if you don't, trapped in a situation where any choice leads to the same horrific outcome. The paradox transforms moral certainty into moral quicksand. Actions that seem clearly right or wrong in a linear timeline become morally ambiguous when trapped in causal loops. The very attempt to do good becomes suspect when it might be the mechanism that enables evil. The Hitler paradox becomes even more complex when you consider multiple time travelers and competing moral visions. What if you kill Hitler, but another time traveler from a different timeline comes back to prevent you from killing Hitler? What if there are dozens of time travelers from various timelines, all with different moral calculations about whether Hitler should live or die? Maybe one time traveler believes that Hitler's death will prevent the Holocaust. Another believes that Hitler's death will lead to something worse. A third believes that Hitler should live, but be prevented from gaining political power. A fourth believes that Hitler should gain power, but be stopped before implementing the final solution. Each time traveler acts on their own moral convictions, but their competing interventions create a chaotic web of cause and effect where no one can predict the ultimate outcome. The timeline becomes a battlefield of competing moral visions, each one potentially triggering new paradoxes and new moral dilemmas. The very multiplicity of moral agents trying to optimize history creates conditions where no optimization is possible, where every attempt to improve things is cancelled out by competing attempts at improvement. Some proposed solutions to the Hitler paradox are almost as disturbing as the paradox itself. One suggestion is that the universe has a kind of built-in ethical protection system that prevents you from committing acts that would create moral paradoxes. Under this view, if you try to kill Hitler, the universe will somehow prevent you from succeeding. Your gun will jam, you'll be arrested before you can act, or you'll be struck by a convenient bolt of lightning. But this solution implies that the universe itself has moral preferences, that the laws of physics are somehow aligned with particular ethical principles. It raises the question of whose morality is built into the fabric of reality. If the universe prevents you from killing Hitler, does that mean the universe considers his survival morally necessary? Does the cosmos have opinions about human rights, justice, and the value of life? This interpretation transforms the universe into a kind of cosmic utilitarian calculator, making moral judgments on a scale that humans cannot comprehend. Maybe Hitler's survival is necessary for some greater good that we can't perceive. Maybe the Holocaust, horrible as it is, prevents some even worse catastrophe that we can't imagine. The universe becomes a moral agent whose decisions are based on calculations too complex for human understanding. Another proposed solution is even more unsettling. Perhaps the Hitler paradox reveals that in a universe with time travel, traditional concepts of good and evil become meaningless. Maybe moral responsibility disappears when cause and effect become circular. Maybe ethics itself is just a temporary illusion that breaks down when you can travel through time. Under this view, Hitler's actions aren't really evil in any meaningful sense. They're just necessary components of a causal loop that has no beginning and no end. The Holocaust becomes not a moral catastrophe, but a temporal inevitability. No more good or evil than gravity or thermodynamics. Moral judgment becomes impossible when every action is both cause and effect of every other action. This interpretation strips human suffering of its moral significance. The pain of Holocaust victims becomes just another data point in a complex causal equation, rather than a moral tragedy requiring response and prevention. Evil actions aren't moral failures. They're just mechanical components in a deterministic temporal machine. But perhaps the most disturbing implication of the Hitler paradox is what it suggests about moral knowledge and ethical certainty. We think we know that the Holocaust was evil, that Hitler was a monster, that preventing these atrocities would be morally good. But the paradox reveals that our moral knowledge might be contingent on our position in linear time. If you're trapped in a causal loop where preventing the Holocaust causes the Holocaust, then the moral status of the Holocaust becomes ambiguous. Is it evil if it's self-preventing? Is it good if attempting to stop it causes it to happen? The clear moral judgments that seem so obvious in linear time become confused and contradictory when time becomes circular. This raises the terrifying possibility that all of our moral knowledge is just temporal prejudice based on our limited perspective within linear time. Maybe good and evil are illusions created by causality, and in a universe where causality can be manipulated through time travel, these illusions break down completely. The Hitler paradox forces us to confront some of the deepest and most unsettling questions about morality, responsibility, and the nature of good and evil. It shows us that moral action might become impossible when time travel is available, not because we lack the power to change things, but because the very attempt to change things creates the moral problems we're trying to solve. The Hitler paradox stands as perhaps the most morally devastating of all time travel paradoxes. It reveals that time travel wouldn't just give us the power to change history. It might strip history of its moral meaning entirely, transforming clear questions of good and evil into endless loops of causal ambiguity, where every answer generates the problem it was meant to solve. The Twins Paradox. Temporal version. The breakdown of identity. Now let's explore a paradox that strikes at the very heart of personal identity, and what it means to exist as a continuous self through time. The temporal twins. Paradox is a variation of Einstein's famous relativity thought experiment, but with time travel elements that make it far more psychologically disturbing and philosophically challenging than its relativistic counterpart. Here's the scenario. Imagine you have an identical twin. You're both 30 years old, genetically identical down to the last chromosome, with shared memories of growing up together in the same house, attending the same schools, experiencing the same family events. You've lived parallel lives, shaped by the same environment, the same parents, the same cultural influences. In many ways, you're as close to being the same person as two different individuals can possibly be. One day, you make a decision that will forever alter the relationship between you and your twin. You decide to use a time machine to travel 50 years into the future, while your twin chooses to live through those 50 years normally, experiencing each day, each month, each year as they naturally unfold. Your twin will age normally, accumulating 5 decades of experiences, relationships, joys, sorrows, and gradual physical and mental changes. You, on the other hand, will skip over those 50 years entirely, arriving in the future as suddenly as you departed from the present. The question that haunts this scenario is deceptively simple. When you reunite in the future, who is older, and what does that even mean? If time travel means instantaneously skipping through time, then you should be 30 years old when you arrive in the future, while your twin is now 80. But this simple calculation opens up a philosophical abyss about the nature of identity, aging, experience, and what it means to be human. Here's where it gets complicated. What does it actually mean to skip through time? Did you experience the journey? Did you age during the process of time travel? Did you dream, think, or maintain consciousness during the temporal transition? Or did you simply blink out of existence in 2025 and blink back into existence in 2075 with no subjective experience of the intervening time? The paradox reveals profound problems with our understanding of personal identity and continuity of self. In normal circumstances, we understand aging as a continuous process of lived experience. You don't just suddenly become older. You experience each moment, each day, each year of aging. Your memories accumulate like sedimentary layers, each new experience building upon the last. Your body changes gradually. Cells divide and die, muscles strengthen or weaken, skin shows the effects of time and weather. Your personality develops and evolves through countless interactions, challenges, successes, and failures. Aging isn't just about the passage of time. It's about the experience of living through that time. It's the accumulation of wisdom through trial and error, the deepening of understanding through reflection, the development of character through facing difficulties. When we say someone has aged well, or grown wise with age, we're not just talking about the number of years they've survived, but about how they've used those years to develop as human beings. But time travel disrupts this continuity in ways that challenge the very concept of identity. If you travel to the future without experiencing the intervening years, are you really the same person who left? You have no memories of the events that occurred during your absence. You haven't grown, learned, suffered, or changed. You haven't accumulated the experiences that normally transform a 30-year-old into an 80-year-old. In what sense are you the same individual who began the journey? Your twin, meanwhile, has lived through 50 years of experiences that you can't even imagine. They've aged, learned, suffered, loved, lost, and grown. They've watched the world change around them, adapted to new technologies, witnessed historical events, formed and lost relationships. They've become a fundamentally different person through the natural process of living, accumulating half a century of experiences that have shaped their thoughts, emotions, and worldview. When you reunite, you might share genetic material and childhood memories, but you're essentially meeting a stranger who happens to share your original face. Your twin has 50 years of additional life experience that you lack entirely. They've lived through events you've only heard about secondhand. They've developed perspectives and wisdom that come only from lived experience. They've aged in ways that go far beyond physical appearance. They've aged emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. But the paradox becomes even more disturbing when you consider the reverse journey. What if after reuniting with your aged twin, you decide to travel back in time 50 years to return to your original era? Now you have knowledge of future events that your younger contemporaries lack. You've seen how the world develops. You know which technologies succeed and which fail. You understand the long-term consequences of current decisions. Are you still the same person you were when you first started your temporal journey? Or have you become something else entirely? This creates a hierarchy of experience that doesn't exist in normal human relationships. Your twin has lived through 50 years that you skipped, but you have knowledge of the future that they experienced naturally. You both have gaps in your understanding of each other's experiences, creating a form of temporal alienation that makes genuine communication and connection difficult or impossible. The temporal twins. Paradox also raises unsettling questions about consciousness and the continuity of experience. When you travel through time, what happens to your consciousness during the journey? This question becomes crucial for understanding who you are when you arrive at your destination. If you experience the journey, if your consciousness remains active and aware during the time travel process, then you age normally during time travel, which defeats the entire premise of the thought experiment. You might arrive 50 years in the future, but you would have experienced those 50 years passing, even if you experienced them differently than your twin did. The time travel becomes just an alternative form of living through time rather than truly skipping over it. But if you don't experience the journey, if your consciousness simply jumps from one moment to another with no subjective experience of the intervening time, then there's a fundamental gap in your consciousness, a period where you simply don't exist as a thinking, experiencing being. This raises the terrifying possibility that time travel involves a kind of death and rebirth, where the person who arrives at the destination might be a copy of the person who began the journey, rather than the same continuous individual. Consider this possibility. When you step into the time machine, your consciousness ends. The person who emerges from the time machine 50 years later has your memories, your personality, and your physical appearance. But they're not actually you. They're a new person who happens to be identical to you. The original you died the moment you activated the time machine, and what emerges is essentially a clone with your memories who mistakenly believes they're the same person who started the journey. This interpretation makes time travel equivalent to suicide, followed by the creation of a replica. Every time you travel through time, you die, and a new person with your identity takes your place. The continuity of self that we take for granted in normal life is completely severed by the temporal journey. You think you're traveling through time, but you're actually just creating copies of yourself while destroying the original. The philosophical implications are staggering. If this interpretation is correct, then time travel is perhaps the most profoundly evil technology imaginable, because it destroys human consciousness while creating the illusion of continuity. Every time traveler is unknowingly committing suicide, while their replicas live under the false belief that they're the same people who started the journey. But even if we reject this interpretation, and assume that consciousness somehow survives time travel intact, we're still left with profound questions about identity and continuity. Consider this variation. What if you travel back in time and meet your younger self? You now have additional life experience that your younger self lacks. You've seen the consequences of decisions your younger self hasn't yet made. You understand mistakes that your younger self will make. In what sense are you the same person? Your younger self will grow up to become you, but you've already lived through experiences that your younger self hasn't yet had. You're meeting yourself, but you're also meeting someone who is fundamentally different from who you've become. The conversation between you and your younger self becomes a dialogue between two different people who happen to share the same identity, past you and future you, connected by continuity of memory but separated by years of experience. This raises disturbing questions about the nature of self and identity over time. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Most people would say yes, despite the fact that your thoughts, feelings, knowledge, and even physical body have changed dramatically. We maintain a sense of continuous identity through time despite constant change, anchored by memory and psychological continuity. But time travel severs this continuity in ways that challenge our most basic understanding of selfhood. If you can meet different versions of yourself from different times, which one is the real you? Are they all equally real? Are they different people who share the same origin, or the same person existing at different temporal locations? The paradox becomes even more complex when you consider multiple trips through time. Imagine you travel forward 20 years, then back 10 years, then forward 30 years, then back 15 years, creating a tangled web of temporal movements. Your subjective age, your chronological age, and your biological age all become disconnected from each other in ways that make the concept of age meaningless. What does it mean to be a certain age when those three measures no longer align? If you've subjectively experienced 35 years of consciousness, but have been alive for 50 chronological years, while your body has only aged 25 years due to time travel, how old are you? The simple question of age becomes impossible to answer in any meaningful way. The psychological implications are staggering. How do you maintain a sense of continuous identity when your experience of time becomes fragmented? How do you relate to friends and family when you've aged at different rates or in different directions through time? How do you plan for the future when your personal timeline has become a tangled web of forwards and backwards movements? Consider the social and emotional consequences. If you travel forward in time and skip 20 years of your life, you miss 20 years of relationships with the people you care about. Your friends age and change while you remain static. Your parents grow older and eventually die while you're absent. Your children grow up without you. When you return from the future, you're a stranger to the people who should know you best. But it's worse than just being absent. You're absent by choice. Unlike someone who dies unexpectedly or is separated by circumstances beyond their control, you deliberately abandon the people in your life to pursue temporal travel. How do you justify missing your child's entire childhood because you wanted to see the future? How do you explain to your aging parents that you chose to skip the years when they needed you most? The temporal twins. Paradox also raises questions about memory and its role in maintaining identity. If you travel to the future and then return to the past, do you remember the future events you witnessed? If so, how does this knowledge affect your behavior and your relationships with people who haven't yet experienced those events? Your knowledge of the future makes you fundamentally different from the person you were before the journey. You know things that haven't happened yet. You understand consequences that aren't yet apparent. You've seen how current relationships and situations develop over time. This knowledge creates a barrier between you and your contemporaries that can never be crossed. You know their futures in ways they can't know themselves. But this knowledge also becomes a burden. If you know that a friend will die in 5 years, how do you interact with them naturally? If you know that a relationship will end badly, can you invest in it emotionally? If you know that certain choices will lead to regret, can you allow people to make those choices without interfering? Your knowledge of the future transforms every present moment into a shadow of what you know is coming. Some interpretations suggest that memory itself might be subject to temporal paradoxes. Perhaps traveling through time creates false memories, or perhaps it erases real memories. Maybe the act of time travel fundamentally alters your brain in ways that make you a different person entirely, not through the addition of new experiences, but through the corruption or replacement of existing memories. This possibility is perhaps the most terrifying of all, because it suggests that time travel doesn't just disrupt your future, it destroys your past. If your memories are altered by temporal travel, then your entire sense of identity, everything that makes you who you are, becomes suspect. You might return from a time travel journey believing you're the same person who started it, while actually being someone completely different with fabricated memories of a life you never lived. The continuity of self that we take for granted might be just another casualty of temporal manipulation. The person who emerges from the time machine might have your face and your name, but their memories, personality, and sense of identity might be temporal artifacts rather than genuine personal history. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the temporal twins paradox is what it reveals about the nature of human experience and the meaning of life itself. If you can skip through time, avoiding the slow accumulation of experiences that normally define human existence, what does it mean to be human? Much of what we consider valuable about life comes from the process of living through time. The gradual development of wisdom, the deepening of relationships, the accumulation of experiences that shape our character. If you can bypass this process through time travel, You might gain access to different time periods, but you lose access to the essential human experience of growth through time. Your twin, who chooses to live through 50 years normally, gains something that you can never recover: the authentic experience of a human lifetime. They experience the full arc of human development from young adulthood to old age. They witness the gradual changes in their body, mind, and spirit that come with natural aging. They develop the patience, wisdom, and perspective that can only come from living through decades of varied experiences. You, on the other hand, remain essentially frozen at the moment you began your temporal journey. You might acquire knowledge of different time periods, but you don't acquire the wisdom that comes from living through time. You become a temporal tourist, observing different eras but never fully belonging to any of them, never fully developing the depth and richness of character that comes from natural human development. The information paradox: knowledge without discovery. Let's now explore one of the most subtle and philosophically devastating time travel paradoxes: the information paradox. This paradox deals with the nature of knowledge, discovery, and the fundamental question of where information comes from. While it might seem less dramatic than paradoxes involving death or catastrophe, the information paradox strikes at the very foundations of human achievement, scientific progress, and our understanding of truth itself. Imagine this scenario. You're a lottery player who has never won anything significant in your entire life. Every week, you carefully select numbers, hoping for that life-changing jackpot. But week after week, your numbers fail to match the winning combination. You've resigned yourself to the reality that you're just not lucky when it comes to games of chance. One day, you receive a mysterious envelope in your mail. Inside, you find a handwritten note containing 6 numbers and a date: next week's lottery drawing. The note is unsigned, with no return address, no explanation of how the sender knew these numbers or why they chose to share them with you. Skeptical but curious, you decide to play these numbers, thinking you have nothing to lose. To your absolute amazement, the numbers are completely accurate. You win a massive jackpot, hundreds of millions of dollars that instantly transform your life. Suddenly wealthy beyond your wildest dreams, you become curious about the source of this incredible information. Who sent you those winning numbers, and how did they know what they would be? Using your newfound wealth, you hire private investigators, forensic experts, and data analysts to track down who sent you the envelope. After months of investigation, following paper trails, and analyzing handwriting samples, you discover something incredible. The envelope was sent by yourself, from the future. The handwriting analysis confirms it. The numbers were written in your own hand, but aged in a way that suggests you were older when you wrote them. The paper and ink, when analyzed, contain traces of materials and manufacturing techniques that don't exist yet but will be developed in the coming decades. The postmark, though cleverly forged to look contemporary, contains isotopic signatures that place it decades in the future. The truth becomes clear. Using the lottery winnings, you eventually acquire a time machine, travel back to the past, and send yourself the winning numbers that made your victory possible. The information about the winning numbers exists in a perfect closed loop. You got it from yourself, and you gave it to yourself. The knowledge has no origin point, no moment of discovery or creation. It simply exists in a causal loop, appearing to create itself through the mechanism of temporal circulation. Here's the mind-bending question. Where did the information about the winning numbers originally come from? The answer is nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The information has no source, no beginning, no moment when it first came into existence. It's information that bootstraps itself into existence through temporal loops, violating our most basic assumptions about how knowledge works. This is the information paradox, and it strikes at the heart of how we understand knowledge, discovery, and the nature of truth itself. In our normal experience of the world, information has sources. Scientific discoveries are made by researchers who observe phenomena, formulate hypotheses, and conduct experiments. Mathematical theorems are proven by mathematicians who work through logical steps and reasoning. Lottery numbers are generated by random processes or careful calculations. Every piece of knowledge has an origin story, a moment when it came into existence or was first discovered by a human mind. But the information paradox creates knowledge that exists without ever being created or discovered. It's information that appears to generate itself through temporal manipulation, existing in causal loops that have no beginning and no end. This violates everything we think we know about the relationship between information and reality. Let's explore the deeper implications of this paradox, starting with what it means for our understanding of randomness and probability. In the lottery scenario, the winning numbers were supposedly determined by a random drawing, balls bouncing around in a machine influenced by countless microscopic factors that make the outcome genuinely unpredictable. But in the paradox timeline, were the numbers really random? The numbers that win are the ones you received from your future self, which are the ones that won, which are the ones you sent back to yourself. The apparent randomness of the lottery becomes an illusion. The outcome was predetermined not by the mechanical process of the drawing, but by the causal loop itself. The lottery drawing doesn't determine the winning numbers. The temporal loop determines them, and the lottery drawing merely confirms what was already predetermined by the circulation of information through time. This raises profound questions about the nature of randomness, probability, and determinism. If information can loop back through time to influence its own creation, does true randomness exist? Are the outcomes of probabilistic events really uncertain, or are they fixed by temporal loops we're not aware of? The information paradox suggests that what appears to be random might actually be predetermined by causal loops operating outside our normal perception of linear time. Consider a more complex variation that reveals even deeper philosophical problems. Imagine you're a scientist working on a difficult research problem that has puzzled experts for decades. You've been struggling for months without making significant progress when suddenly you receive a package containing a complete solution to your problem. Equations, proofs, experimental data, theoretical frameworks, everything you need to solve the mystery. The solution is brilliant, innovative, and completely correct. It demonstrates insights that would have taken you years to develop, if you ever could have developed them at all. It represents a genuine breakthrough in human understanding, the kind of discovery that wins Nobel Prizes and transforms entire fields of knowledge. You publish the work and receive great acclaim for your discovery. Scientists around the world praise your brilliance and insight. Your solution opens up new avenues of research, enables new technologies, and advances human knowledge in ways that benefit millions of people. Years later, you acquire a time machine and decide to help your younger self by sending back the solution you discovered. But here's the devastating truth. You didn't really discover anything. You just received information from your future self and passed it along. The scientific knowledge exists in a causal loop with no actual moment of discovery or creation. The breakthrough that advanced human understanding was never actually achieved by human intelligence. It was just information circulating through time without ever being genuinely created. This variation is particularly disturbing because it undermines the entire concept of scientific progress and human achievement. If knowledge can exist in temporal loops, then what we think of as great discoveries might just be information circulating through time without ever being genuinely created by human intelligence, creativity, or effort. Think about the implications for the history of science. How many of our greatest discoveries might actually be information borrowed from the future rather than achievements of human intellect? Did Newton really discover the laws of gravity, or did he receive them from a future time traveler? Did Einstein really develop the theory of relativity, or was it information circulating in a temporal loop? Did Watson and Crick really figure out the structure of DNA, or were they just links in a causal chain that has no beginning? The information paradox threatens to strip human achievement of its meaning by suggesting that our greatest intellectual accomplishments might not be accomplishments at all, but rather temporary custody of information that belongs to no one and everyone simultaneously. The paradox also raises questions about intellectual property and originality. Who owns knowledge that exists in a causal loop? Who deserves credit for discoveries that were never actually discovered? If Shakespeare's plays can exist in bootstrap paradoxes, if scientific theories can loop back through time, what does it mean to be creative or original? Consider the legal and ethical implications. If you publish a scientific breakthrough that you received from your future self, are you guilty of plagiarism? You're presenting someone else's work as your own, but that someone else is you. You're stealing from yourself, but the self you're stealing from only has the knowledge because they stole it from you. The entire concept of intellectual theft becomes meaningless when applied to temporal loops. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the information paradox is what it suggests about the nature of truth itself. We generally think of truth as something that exists independently of our knowledge of it. Mathematical facts are true whether we discover them or not. Physical laws operate whether we understand them or not. Historical events happened whether we remember them or not. Truth is objective, existing in the world regardless of our subjective awareness of it. But the information paradox creates truths that seem to depend on their own temporal circulation. Consider this philosophical puzzle. If a mathematical theorem exists in a causal loop with no moment of original proof or discovery, is it really true? Or is it just self-consistent information circulating through time? The theorem might be logically sound, internally consistent, and practically useful. But if it was never actually proven by anyone, what gives it its truth value? The traditional correspondence between mathematical proofs and mathematical truth breaks down when the proof exists without ever being constructed by human reasoning. This suggests that truth might not be as objective and independent as we assume. In a universe where information can circulate through temporal loops, truth might become contingent on the existence of causal patterns rather than on objective reality. Facts might be true not because they correspond to reality, but because they form consistent loops through time. The paradox becomes even more disturbing when you consider its potential scale. How much of human knowledge might exist in temporal loops that we're not aware of? How many of our cherished beliefs, scientific theories, cultural traditions, and technological innovations might be nothing more than information circulating backward through time from unknown future sources? Maybe the great works of literature were never written by their supposed authors, but are instead temporal artifacts circulating through causal loops. Maybe our scientific understanding of the universe is based on theories that were never actually developed by human minds, but are instead self-validating information patterns sustained by time travel. Maybe our entire cultural heritage is built on knowledge that has no authentic origin. This raises the terrifying possibility that human civilization itself might be a hollow facade, built on borrowed information that belongs to no one. Our sense of progress, achievement, and cultural development might be illusions created by the circulation of future knowledge through past minds. We think we're creating and discovering, but we might just be temporary repositories for information that exists in causal loops beyond our understanding. Some physicists have proposed that the information paradox might actually be resolved by the quantum nature of information itself. In quantum mechanics, information is subject to various conservation laws and fundamental limits. The quantum no-cloning theorem, for instance, states that it's impossible to create perfect copies of arbitrary quantum states. Some physicists argue that these quantum constraints would prevent information from existing in perfect causal loops. The act of transmitting information through time might necessarily degrade or alter it, preventing true bootstrap paradoxes from forming. Just as a photocopy of a photocopy gradually loses quality with each generation, information sent through time might accumulate errors and degradation that eventually break the causal loop. But this solution raises its own questions about the nature of reality and whether true time travel is possible at all. If the universe prevents informational paradoxes through quantum mechanical effects, it suggests that information has a fundamental relationship to the structure of space-time that we don't yet understand. How would such quantum protection work? Would it require monitoring every information transfer in the universe to ensure that no causal loops are created? Would it need to track the complete history of every piece of information to prevent paradoxical circulation? The computational requirements for such a system seem impossibly vast, perhaps requiring more information storage and processing power than exists in the entire universe. Others suggest that the paradox reveals something fundamental about the nature of information itself. Maybe information, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. Under this interpretation, the information paradox isn't a problem to be solved, but a feature of how information actually works in a universe where time travel is possible. This view is supported by some interpretations of quantum mechanics, which suggest that information is a fundamental property of reality, as basic as matter and energy. If information is truly fundamental, then perhaps it can exist in causal loops without violating any deep principles of physics. The appearance of information without origin might just be our limited perspective on a more complex informational structure that exists outside of linear time. But this interpretation raises disturbing questions about the relationship between information and reality. If information can exist in temporal loops, what distinguishes real knowledge from fictional knowledge? If a false theory can be sustained by a bootstrap paradox, how do we distinguish between truth and self-consistent fiction? Consider this chilling variation. Someone travels back in time with a completely false scientific theory, perhaps a complex but incorrect model of how consciousness works, or a detailed but fictitious account of historical events that never happened. They present this false information to researchers in the past who accept it and build their understanding around it. Over time, this false information influences the development of science, technology, and culture in ways that eventually lead to the creation of time travel technology. The false theory becomes self-validating through its causal loop. It's true, not because it accurately describes reality, but because it creates a consistent temporal pattern. The distinction between truth and fiction breaks down when information can bootstrap itself through time. This possibility is particularly terrifying because it suggests that our entire knowledge base might contain arbitrary amounts of false information that appears true simply because it exists in causal loops. We might be living in a world built on self-validating fictions, where truth and falsehood are distinguished not by their correspondence to reality, but by their participation in temporal patterns. The information paradox also has profound implications for education and the transmission of knowledge across generations. In normal circumstances, knowledge passes from teacher to student through a process of learning and understanding. Teachers have acquired their knowledge through experience, study, and instruction from their own teachers, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge transmission that stretches back through history. But if knowledge can exist in temporal loops, this entire model breaks down. A teacher might possess information that they never actually learned in any meaningful sense. They might have received it fully formed from their future self, or from students who learned it from them, or from sources that exist only within causal loops. This creates a disturbing hierarchy of authenticity in human knowledge. Some information might be genuine, discovered through observation, reasoning, and experience. Other information might be temporal artifacts, patterns of knowledge that exist without ever being genuinely created or understood by human minds. But there might be no way to distinguish between these categories, leaving us unable to determine which of our beliefs are based on authentic human understanding and which are simply temporal illusions. The paradox extends to all forms of cultural transmission. If artistic works can exist in temporal loops, then our cultural heritage might be filled with creations that were never actually created by human creativity. If historical accounts can circulate through time, then our understanding of the past might be based on information that has no authentic origin in the events it claims to describe. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that bootstrap paradoxes are already occurring all around us, but we can never detect them because successful informational loops leave no trace of their temporal origins. If information can circulate through time without revealing its causal history, then our entire knowledge base might be filled with facts, theories, and ideas that exist without creation. The information paradox ultimately forces us to question not just what we know, but how we know it, and whether the very concept of knowledge has any meaning in a universe where information can bootstrap itself into existence. It reveals that time travel wouldn't just give us access to information from different time periods. It might fundamentally alter the nature of information itself, transforming knowledge from something that must be discovered or created into something that can simply exist without origin. The information paradox stands as perhaps the most epistemologically devastating of all time travel paradoxes. It threatens not just our understanding of specific facts or theories, but our entire framework for distinguishing between truth and fiction, between genuine knowledge and elaborate illusion. It suggests that in a universe where information can circulate through time, The very foundations of human understanding might rest on quicksand. Patterns of knowledge that seem solid and real, but actually exist without any ultimate foundation in discovery, creation, or authentic human achievement. The multiple timelines. Paradox, the futility of change. Now we come to a paradox that seems to offer a solution to many of the logical problems we've discussed, but in doing so, creates an even more profound existential crisis: the multiple timelines paradox. This paradox is particularly insidious because it appears to be the most logical and scientifically plausible resolution to time travel contradictions, while simultaneously rendering all time travel meaningless and stripping human action of its redemptive power. Here's how it works. Every time you travel back and change something in the past, you don't actually change your past. You create a new alternative timeline. Your original timeline continues to exist unchanged, with all its tragedies, mistakes, and suffering intact, while your actions create a branching point that leads to a different future. You can prevent disasters, save lives, and fix historical mistakes, but only in the new timeline you've created. Your original timeline, with all its pain and problems, remains exactly as it was, frozen in its tragic state for eternity. This seems like an elegant solution to paradoxes like the grandfather paradox. If you go back and prevent your grandparents from meeting, you don't create a logical contradiction. You just create a timeline where you were never born. But you yourself continue to exist as a visitor from the original timeline where you were born. No paradox, no logical contradiction, no violation of causality. The mathematics work out perfectly, the physics remains consistent, and the logical problems disappear. But here's the devastating implication. If this is how time travel actually works, then you can never actually change your own past. Every tragedy you experienced, every loss you suffered, every mistake you made, every moment of pain and regret, all of it remains permanent and unchangeable. You can create better timelines for other versions of people, but you can never improve your own history or undo your own pain. Imagine you lost a loved one in a car accident, and the grief has haunted you for decades. The accident was preventable. If only the traffic light had been timed differently. If only your loved one had left 5 minutes later. If only you had been there to drive them instead. The what-ifs torture you endlessly, and when you gain access to a time machine, you see it as your chance for redemption. Your opportunity to undo the worst tragedy of your life. You travel back to the day of the accident and successfully prevent it. You alter the timing, you change the circumstances. You ensure that your loved one takes a different route. In the new timeline you create, the accident never happens. Your loved one lives a full and happy life, growing old surrounded by family and friends, experiencing all the joys and achievements that were cut short in your original timeline. But they're not really your loved one. They're an alternative version from a different timeline. Your loved one, the specific person you knew and cherished, the individual whose laugh you remember, whose dreams you shared, whose death devastated you. They remain dead in your original timeline. Your grief remains unresolved, your loss unchanged. The person you saved is similar to your loved one, sharing the same face and many of the same experiences. But they're not the same individual whose death caused you so much pain. The multiple timelines. Paradox transforms time travel from a tool of redemption into a form of cosmic exile. Every time you travel through time, you become more disconnected from any fixed reality. You become a temporal wanderer, always visiting worlds that are similar to but not quite the same as your own, never able to return to or repair the timeline you actually came from. Consider the psychological implications for the time traveler. You save a version of your loved one in an alternative timeline, but how do you relate to this person who shares the face and memories of someone from your past, but who never actually experienced the relationship you remember? They might look exactly the same, sound exactly the same, even have many of the same personality traits and memories. But the specific history you shared with your loved one never happened in their timeline. This creates a form of temporal alienation that's almost impossible to bear. You're surrounded by people who are almost, but not quite, the people you remember. Every conversation feels slightly off. Every interaction carries the weight of relationships that never happened. You know things about these people that they don't know about themselves because those things happened in a different timeline. You love them for experiences they never had, for moments they never shared with you. The paradox becomes even more isolating when you consider that every person you interact with in alternative timelines is also an alternative version of people you might know. The friends, family members, and loved ones in each timeline are similar to but distinct from the people in your original timeline. You become a ghost-haunting alternative versions of your own life, never able to truly connect with anyone because they're all alternative versions of real people. But the multiple timelines. Paradox raises even more disturbing questions about the nature of reality and identity. If every possible timeline exists simultaneously, then every possible version of yourself also exists. There are timelines where you made different choices, experienced different outcomes, became a different person. Which version is the real you? What makes your timeline more valid or important than any other? This leads to a kind of existential vertigo that's difficult to comprehend. If infinite versions of yourself exist across infinite timelines, what makes your experiences, your choices, your life meaningful? You might suffer in your timeline while alternative versions of yourself live in perfect happiness. You might struggle with moral decisions while alternative versions of yourself make different choices that lead to better outcomes. You might fail at your goals while alternative versions achieve everything you ever dreamed of. The knowledge that infinite versions of yourself exist across infinite timelines creates a profound crisis of significance. Why should your suffering matter if there are versions of you that never suffered? Why should your achievements be meaningful if there are versions of you that achieved more? Why should your choices carry moral weight if every possible choice is made by some version of you in some timeline? But perhaps most disturbing is the implication that every evil action is balanced by every good action across the multiverse of timelines. For every timeline where genocide occurs, there are timelines where it's prevented. For every timeline where innocent people suffer, there are timelines where they live in peace. The moral weight of individual actions disappears when every possibility is realized somewhere in the infinite expanse of alternative realities. This creates a kind of moral paralysis. If every choice you make is balanced by alternative versions of yourself, making different choices, then no individual decision carries ultimate moral significance. You can choose to help someone, but in another timeline, you choose not to help them. You can choose to prevent suffering, but in another timeline, you cause suffering. The net moral impact of your choices across all timelines is always zero. The multiple timelines. Paradox also raises profound questions about personal responsibility and the meaning of moral action. If you travel back in time and prevent a genocide in an alternative timeline, are you a hero? You've saved millions of lives in that timeline, but those same people still died in your original timeline. You've created a better world, but you haven't actually reduced the total amount of suffering in the multiverse. You've just redistributed it across different realities. Consider this chilling implication. If every timeline exists simultaneously, then every possible form of suffering also exists simultaneously. For every timeline where people are happy, healthy, and free, there are timelines where they're miserable, sick, and oppressed. The total amount of suffering across all timelines is infinite, regardless of what any individual time traveler does. Your efforts to reduce suffering in one timeline are meaningless in the context of infinite timelines where that suffering still occurs. But the paradox becomes even more devastating when you consider the implications for love and human connection. If you fall in love with someone in an alternative timeline, are you really in love with them? Or are you in love with their resemblance to someone from your original timeline? Can you form genuine relationships with people who are similar to, but not identical to the people you've known? Every relationship you form in alternative timelines becomes suspect. Are you connecting with these people for who they are, or for who they remind you of? Are your feelings genuine, or are they just projections based on relationships from other timelines? The very concept of authentic human connection breaks down when everyone you meet is simultaneously the same as and different from people you've known before. The multiple timelines. Paradox also creates a hierarchy of reality that doesn't exist in normal human experience. Some timelines are original, while others are created through time travel intervention. But what makes an original timeline more real or important than a created one? If you create a timeline where people are happier and healthier than in the original timeline, isn't the new timeline better even if it's artificial? This raises disturbing questions about the nature of authenticity and the value we place on natural versus artificial realities. If you can create a timeline where genocide never happened, where diseases were cured earlier, where people made better choices, is that timeline less valuable because it was created through intervention rather than natural development? But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the multiple timelines paradox is what it reveals about the nature of regret and redemption. In our normal understanding of life, regret serves a purpose. It motivates us to make better choices in the future, to learn from our mistakes, to grow and change as people. The possibility of redemption, of making amends for past wrongs, gives meaning to moral struggle and personal growth. The multiple timelines paradox eliminates this possibility entirely. There is no redemption because there is no way to undo past wrongs in your own timeline. There is no learning from mistakes because past mistakes remain permanent fixtures of your original reality. Regret becomes a purely destructive emotion because it motivates you to fix things that cannot be fixed and to undo things that cannot be undone. Every attempt at redemption becomes a cruel parody of genuine moral action. You can save versions of people in alternative timelines, but you can't save the actual people whose deaths caused your guilt. You can prevent versions of tragedies in alternative realities, but you can't prevent the actual tragedies that haunt your memories. Your moral actions become elaborate forms of self-deception, where you pretend that helping similar people in different timelines somehow addresses the harm caused to specific people in your own timeline. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of memory and identity across multiple timelines. As you travel through different timelines, each with different histories and different versions of people you know, how do you maintain a coherent sense of self? Your memories become increasingly disconnected from the realities you inhabit, making you a stranger to yourself as much as to others. You remember relationships that never happened in your current timeline. You carry guilt for actions that never occurred in the reality you're inhabiting. You feel love for people who never existed in their current forms. Your internal landscape becomes a patchwork of experiences from multiple timelines, creating a fractured identity that belongs fully to none of them. Consider the long-term psychological effects of living as a timeline wanderer. Over time, you accumulate memories and relationships from dozens or hundreds of different timelines. You remember multiple versions of the same events, multiple versions of the same people, multiple versions of your own life. Which memories are real? Which relationships matter? Which version of your life story is the authentic one? The weight of infinite possibilities becomes crushing. Every choice you make is shadowed by knowledge of all the choices you didn't make in other timelines. Every relationship you form is haunted by memories of different relationships with different versions of the same people. Every moment of happiness is undermined by awareness of all the timelines where that happiness doesn't exist. But perhaps the most disturbing implication of the multiple timelines paradox is what it suggests about the nature of existence itself. If every possible timeline exists simultaneously, then existence becomes infinite and meaningless at the same time. Every possible life is lived. Every possible choice is made. Every possible outcome is realized. The concept of possibility disappears because everything is actual somewhere in the infinite expanse of alternative realities. This infinite actualization of all possibilities strips individual lives of their uniqueness and significance. Your specific experiences, your particular choices, your individual story become insignificant in the context of infinite alternative stories being lived by infinite alternative versions of yourself. You are simultaneously unique, the only version of yourself in your specific timeline, and completely replaceable, just one of infinite versions across infinite timelines. The multiple timelines paradox also raises profound questions about the nature of time itself. If all timelines exist simultaneously, then the past, present, and future of every possible timeline exist simultaneously as well. Time becomes not a flowing river, but a vast landscape where every moment of every possible timeline exists eternally. Your travel through time becomes just movement through this vast landscape of actualized possibilities. But this view of time eliminates the very concept of change that makes time travel seem meaningful. If all possibilities already exist simultaneously, then time travel doesn't change anything. It just reveals what already exists. You're not creating new timelines, you're discovering timelines that already exist in the vast landscape of actualized possibilities. Your actions don't change reality. They just determine which reality you experience. This transforms time travelers from agents of change into explorers of pre-existing realities. Every intervention you make, every timeline you create, every alternative you explore already existed before you arrived. You're not changing history. You're just navigating through the infinite maze of histories that have always existed simultaneously. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics support this view of multiple timelines. The many worlds interpretation suggests that every quantum measurement creates a branching of the universe into multiple parallel realities. Every possible outcome of every quantum event occurs in some branch of reality. Time travel might simply be movement between these pre-existing branches rather than the creation of new ones. But this interpretation makes time travel a form of cosmic tourism rather than a tool for changing reality. You're not fixing the past. You're just visiting different versions of the past that already exist. You're not preventing tragedies. You're just moving to timelines where those tragedies already didn't happen. Your sense of moral agency becomes an illusion created by your limited perspective within the infinite landscape of actualized possibilities. The multiple timelines. Paradox ultimately reveals that time travel, if it works through the creation of alternative timelines, offers only the illusion of redemption, while providing no actual relief from suffering or regret. It allows you to witness better realities without inhabiting them, to save similar people without saving the specific people you care about, to prevent similar tragedies without preventing the actual tragedies that motivated your intervention. Perhaps most tragically, the multiple timelines paradox suggests that the very desire to change the past through time travel is fundamentally misguided. The past cannot be changed because it continues to exist in its original form regardless of what alternatives you create. The people who suffered continue to suffer in their original timeline. The tragedies that occurred continue to occur in their original form. The mistakes you made continue to exist as permanent features of your original reality. Time travel becomes not a tool for fixing the past, but a mechanism for creating elaborate distractions from the unchangeable nature of what has already happened. Instead of providing redemption, it provides only escape, temporary refuge in alternative realities that can never truly address the pain and regret that motivated the journey in the first place. The multiple timelines. Paradox stands as perhaps the most existentially devastating of all time travel paradoxes. It offers logical consistency at the cost of moral meaning, scientific plausibility at the cost of redemptive possibility. It suggests that time travel might be the cruelest technology imaginable, one that allows you to see better worlds while forever denying you the ability to actually live in them, that lets you save everyone except the specific people you actually want to save, that provides infinite possibilities for change while making all change ultimately meaningless. The paradox forces us to confront whether the ability to witness alternative realities is a gift or a curse, whether knowledge of better possibilities enhances life or makes it unbearable, and whether the promise of time travel is actually a cosmic joke played on beings foolish enough to believe that the past can ever truly be escaped or redeemed. The consistency paradox, the universe as cosmic editor. Now we arrive at perhaps the most philosophically unsettling of all time travel paradoxes, the consistency paradox. This paradox is unique because it doesn't create logical contradictions or impossible loops. Instead, it proposes that the universe itself acts as a kind of cosmic editor, automatically preventing paradoxes from occurring through an intricate web of coincidences, interventions, and seemingly random events. While this might sound like a solution to time travel problems, it actually creates far more disturbing implications about the nature of free will, causality, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. Here's how the consistency paradox works. The universe somehow prevents paradoxes from occurring by ensuring that any attempt to change the past in paradox-creating ways will inevitably fail. This isn't just bad luck or poor planning on the part of the time traveler. It's a fundamental feature of reality itself. The laws of physics, the flow of events, and even the behavior of conscious beings all conspire to maintain temporal consistency, creating an invisible but absolute barrier against paradox creation. Let's explore this through a detailed scenario. Imagine you've traveled back in time with the firm intention of preventing your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, thereby creating a classic grandfather paradox. You've planned meticulously, researched the exact time and place where they first encountered each other, and you're determined to ensure that meeting never happens. You arrive at the destined location well before your grandfather is scheduled to appear. You position yourself strategically, ready to intercept him before he can meet your grandmother. Everything seems to be going according to plan. But then, something unexpected happens. Your carefully synchronized watch stops working. Not broken, not damaged. It simply stops, showing the wrong time and causing you to miscalculate when your grandfather will arrive. Frustrated, but not deterred, you rely on other clues to determine the timing. But then a sudden rainstorm erupts from a clear sky, forcing you to seek shelter in a nearby building. The storm is localized and brief, meteorologically impossible, but undeniably real. By the time it passes, you've missed the crucial moment. You try again the next day, but your hotel elevator malfunctions, trapping you for hours. You try once more, but you're struck by a sudden and severe case of food poisoning that leaves you bedridden. Each attempt is thwarted by increasingly improbable events that seem designed specifically to prevent your intervention. Eventually, you realize a disturbing pattern. Every time you attempt to create a paradox, the universe itself seems to actively resist your efforts. It's not that you're unlucky or incompetent. It's that reality itself is working against you, manipulating events, circumstances, and even your own body to ensure that temporal consistency is maintained. This is the consistency paradox in action, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of reality. If the universe actively prevents paradoxes, it suggests that the cosmos itself has preferences, intentions, and the ability to manipulate events to achieve desired outcomes. The universe becomes not just a physical system governed by mathematical laws, but a kind of conscious agent working to preserve its own logical integrity. But let's dig deeper into what this actually means for human agency and free will. If the universe can manipulate events to prevent paradoxes, what does this say about your ability to make genuine choices? When your watch stops at the crucial moment, was that a mechanical failure or divine intervention? When the impossible rainstorm erupts, was that a meteorological anomaly or cosmic editing? When you get food poisoning, was that bad luck or universe-level manipulation of your digestive system? The consistency paradox suggests that what we experience as free will might be nothing more than the universe allowing us to make choices that don't threaten temporal stability. You feel free to choose what to have for breakfast, where to go on vacation, or what career to pursue. But try to do something that would create a paradox, and suddenly your freedom evaporates. The universe becomes a cosmic puppet master, allowing you the illusion of choice while maintaining ultimate control over outcomes that matter to temporal consistency. This creates a hierarchy of free will that's deeply disturbing. Some choices are genuinely free because they don't threaten the timeline. Others are subtly constrained by the universe's need to maintain consistency. And still others are completely impossible because they would create paradoxes. But you can never know which category any given choice falls into until you try to make it. Your sense of freedom becomes an elaborate illusion, maintained by cosmic forces operating beyond your awareness or control. Consider the implications for moral responsibility. If the universe prevents you from committing paradox-creating actions, can you be held responsible for those actions? If you attempt to kill your grandfather, but are prevented by cosmic intervention, are you guilty of attempted murder? Your intention was evil, but the action was physically impossible due to the logical structure of reality. Traditional concepts of guilt and innocence become meaningless when some actions are prevented by the fundamental forces of existence. But the paradox becomes even more unsettling when you consider the scope of cosmic intervention required to maintain consistency. The universe doesn't just need to prevent obvious paradoxes like grandfather killing. It needs to prevent any change that could cascade into paradox-creating events through the butterfly effect. This means that virtually any significant change to the past could potentially require cosmic intervention. Think about the astronomical complexity involved. Every quantum fluctuation, every random event, every human decision that occurs after your arrival in the past could potentially lead to paradox-creating changes. The universe would need to monitor and potentially manipulate trillions of events, from the microscopic level of quantum mechanics to the macroscopic level of human behavior, all to ensure that no causal chain leads to a logical contradiction. This suggests that the universe possesses computational capabilities that dwarf anything we can imagine. It would need to calculate the consequences of every possible event, trace every causal chain through time, and identify every potential paradox before it occurs. Then it would need to intervene in just the right ways, at just the right moments, with just the right degree of subtlety to prevent paradoxes while maintaining the illusion of natural causality. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. If the universe has this level of computational power and control over events, what else might it be manipulating? The consistency paradox suggests that cosmic intervention isn't limited to time travel scenarios. It's a fundamental feature of how reality operates. Maybe the universe is constantly editing events, steering outcomes, and manipulating circumstances to maintain some kind of cosmic consistency that extends far beyond temporal paradoxes. Consider this possibility. Maybe every unlikely coincidence, every stroke of luck, every improbable event in your life is actually cosmic intervention designed to maintain some form of universal consistency. Maybe the universe is constantly making tiny adjustments to reality, nudging events in preferred directions, preventing outcomes that would threaten some deeper form of logical or causal stability. This transforms every aspect of human experience into potential evidence of cosmic manipulation. When you meet your future spouse through an unlikely coincidence, was that chance or cosmic editing? When you narrowly avoid a fatal accident through an improbable sequence of events, was that luck or universal intervention? When you make a crucial discovery through an unexpected insight, was that genius or cosmic guidance? The consistency paradox makes it impossible to distinguish between genuine randomness and cosmic manipulation, between authentic choice and cosmically constrained decision-making, between real luck and universal intervention. Every event becomes suspect. Every coincidence becomes evidence of hidden manipulation. Every choice becomes questionable. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the consistency paradox is what it reveals about the nature of consciousness and identity. If the universe can manipulate events to prevent paradoxes, can it also manipulate minds? When you suddenly lose the motivation to create a paradox, is that a natural change of heart or cosmic mind control? When you forget crucial information at the key moment, is that normal human fallibility or universal memory editing? The paradox suggests that consciousness itself might be subject to cosmic editing. Your thoughts, feelings, memories, and decisions could all be potential targets for universal intervention designed to maintain temporal consistency. The universe might not just manipulate external events. It might manipulate your internal experience as well, altering your mental states to prevent paradox-creating actions. This creates a terrifying possibility. Maybe your entire sense of self is subject to cosmic editing. Maybe the universe regularly adjusts your personality, memories, and decision-making processes to maintain consistency. Maybe the person you think you are is actually a carefully edited version of who you would naturally be, modified by cosmic intervention to ensure that your choices don't threaten the timeline. Consider the implications for personal identity over time. If the universe can edit your consciousness to prevent paradoxes, then your sense of continuous identity becomes questionable. The person who wakes up each morning might be a slightly different person than the one who went to sleep, modified by cosmic editing to ensure temporal consistency. Your memories might be altered, your personality adjusted, your decision-making processes refined, all without your knowledge or consent. The consistency paradox also raises profound questions about the nature of truth and reality. If the universe actively maintains consistency through manipulation and intervention, what does this say about the authenticity of observed events? Are the patterns we see in history, science, and human behavior genuine features of reality? Or are they artifacts of cosmic editing designed to maintain logical consistency? Maybe what we interpret as natural laws are actually the universe's editing rules made visible. Maybe the regularities we observe in physics, chemistry, and biology are not fundamental properties of matter and energy, but rather the observable consequences of cosmic consistency maintenance. The universe might appear to follow mathematical laws because those laws represent the editing principles it uses to maintain logical coherence. This suggests that scientific discovery might not involve uncovering pre-existing truths about reality, but rather discovering the editing rules that the universe uses to maintain consistency. When scientists identify patterns in nature, they might be identifying the algorithms that cosmic consistency requires, rather than fundamental properties of matter and energy. But if this is true, then the entire scientific enterprise becomes suspect. Are we studying objective reality, or are we studying the artificial patterns created by cosmic editing? Do natural laws exist independently of the universe's need to maintain consistency, or are they simply side effects of cosmic manipulation? The distinction between authentic natural phenomena and cosmic editing artifacts becomes impossible to determine. The consistency paradox also has disturbing implications for the concept of progress and human achievement. If the universe manipulates events to maintain consistency, then human progress might not be the result of genuine innovation, creativity, and effort, but rather the consequence of cosmic guidance designed to prevent paradoxes. Maybe technological advancement occurs not because human minds are genuinely creative and innovative, but because the universe needs certain technologies to exist in order to maintain temporal consistency. Maybe scientific breakthroughs happen not because researchers are brilliant and persistent, but because the universe manipulates circumstances to ensure that certain discoveries occur at the right times to prevent causal contradictions. Consider the implications for individual achievement and personal growth. If the universe can manipulate events and even consciousness to maintain consistency, then your successes and failures might not be genuine consequences of your choices and efforts, but rather cosmic adjustments designed to maintain temporal stability. Your achievements might not belong to you. They might belong to the universe's need for consistency. This strips human accomplishment of its meaning and significance. Nobel Prizes, artistic masterpieces, technological innovations, moral victories. All of these might be artifacts of cosmic editing rather than genuine human achievements. The entire history of human civilization might be an elaborate performance directed by universal forces operating beyond human awareness. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when you consider its implications for suffering and evil. If the universe manipulates events to maintain consistency, what does this say about the existence of pain, injustice, and tragedy? Are these genuine features of reality, or are they necessary components of cosmic consistency maintenance? Maybe suffering exists not because the universe is indifferent to human pain, but because suffering serves some function in maintaining temporal consistency. Maybe injustice persists, not because the universe lacks moral preferences, but because justice would create paradoxes that threaten cosmic stability. Maybe evil exists not as an absence of good, but as a necessary element in the universe's consistency maintenance algorithm. This transforms the universe from a morally neutral system into a morally complex agent that makes deliberate choices about which outcomes to allow and which to prevent. The cosmos becomes a utilitarian calculator, permitting suffering when it serves consistency, but preventing it when it would create paradoxes. Evil becomes not a bug in the system, but a feature designed to maintain logical coherence. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the consistency paradox is what it suggests about the illusion of narrative and meaning in human life. We construct stories about our lives, finding patterns and purposes in our experiences, creating coherent narratives that give meaning to our existence. But if the universe actively edits reality to maintain consistency, then these narratives might be artificial constructions created by cosmic manipulation. Your life story might not be a genuine sequence of choices and consequences, but rather a carefully edited narrative designed to maintain temporal consistency. The meaningful connections you see between events might not be authentic patterns, but rather artificial coherence created by cosmic intervention. The sense of purpose and direction in your life might not reflect genuine agency and growth, but rather cosmic scripting designed to prevent paradoxes. This makes every autobiography a potential fiction, every personal narrative a possible artifact of cosmic editing. The stories we tell about ourselves, the meanings we find in our experiences, the purposes we discover in our lives, all of these might be elaborate illusions created by universal manipulation, rather than authentic expressions of human agency and growth. Some interpretations of the consistency paradox suggest that cosmic intervention operates through quantum mechanical effects. Maybe the universe maintains consistency by manipulating quantum probabilities, making paradox-creating events infinitely unlikely while making consistency-maintaining events highly probable. Under this view, quantum mechanics isn't just a description of microscopic randomness. It's the mechanism through which the universe edits reality to maintain logical coherence. This interpretation suggests that what we experience as quantum randomness is actually cosmic editing in action. When quantum events appear to occur randomly, they might actually be precisely controlled by the universe's need to maintain consistency. The uncertainty principle, wave function collapse, and quantum entanglement might all be mechanisms through which cosmic editing operates at the fundamental level of reality. But this raises disturbing questions about the nature of physical law and scientific understanding. If quantum mechanics is actually cosmic editing, masquerading as natural phenomena, then our entire understanding of fundamental physics might be wrong. We might think we're studying objective natural laws when we're actually studying the editing algorithms used by cosmic consistency maintenance. Other interpretations suggest that the consistency paradox operates through consciousness manipulation rather than physical intervention. Maybe the universe maintains consistency, not by changing external events, but by altering the mental states of potential paradox creators. When you lose motivation to kill your grandfather, it's not because external circumstances prevent you. It's because the universe has directly altered your consciousness to eliminate the paradox-creating intention. This interpretation is perhaps even more disturbing because it suggests that cosmic editing operates at the level of thought and intention rather than just external events. Your mind becomes not a private sanctuary of authentic selfhood, but a potential target for cosmic manipulation designed to maintain temporal consistency. Free will becomes not just constrained by external circumstances, but directly controlled by universal forces operating within consciousness itself. The consistency paradox ultimately forces us to confront some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human agency. It suggests that the universe might not be a neutral stage upon which human drama unfolds, but rather an active participant with preferences, intentions, and the power to shape outcomes according to its own logical requirements. If the consistency paradox is correct, then time travel reveals not just the possibility of visiting different times, but the existence of cosmic forces that actively maintain the logical structure of reality itself. The universe becomes not just a physical system, but a kind of cosmic consciousness with the ability and motivation to edit reality in service of consistency maintenance. The consistency paradox stands as perhaps the most philosophically challenging of all time travel paradoxes, because it appears to solve logical problems while creating even deeper metaphysical mysteries. It offers temporal stability at the cost of genuine agency, logical coherence at the cost of authentic experience. It suggests that the price of paradox-free time travel might be nothing less than the discovery that free will, authentic choice, and genuine human agency are elaborate illusions maintained by cosmic forces operating far beyond human understanding or control. The paradox forces us to ask whether we would prefer a universe where paradoxes are possible but free will is genuine, or a universe where consistency is maintained but agency is illusory. It reveals that the dream of time travel might come with a cost far higher than we ever imagined. Not just the risk of logical contradiction, but the discovery that reality itself might be far more controlled, manipulated, and artificial than we ever suspected. The Observer Paradox: the collapse of objective reality. Now let's explore one of the most psychologically disturbing and philosophically devastating time travel paradoxes: the Observer Paradox. This paradox strikes at the very heart of our understanding of objective reality, historical truth, and the nature of existence itself. Unlike other paradoxes that deal with causality or information, the Observer Paradox suggests that the very act of observing the past through time travel fundamentally alters the nature of that past, making it impossible to ever know what really happened. Here's the scenario. You're a historian who has spent decades studying a crucial but mysterious event from the past. Let's say the assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BCE. Despite extensive research, many details remain unclear. Historical accounts conflict, key witnesses left contradictory testimonies, and crucial evidence has been lost to time. You've built your career trying to piece together what actually happened in those final moments in the Senate. But the truth remains frustratingly elusive. Then you gain access to a time machine, and you see the opportunity to finally answer the questions that have plagued historians for millennia. You'll travel back to March 15th, 44 BCE, position yourself as an invisible observer in the Senate, and witness the assassination firsthand. Finally, you'll know the objective truth about one of history's most significant events. You arrive in ancient Rome and carefully position yourself to observe the proceedings. You watch as Caesar enters the Senate, as the conspirators approach, as the first blade strikes. You see everything. Every word spoken, every gesture made, every detail that history books could only speculate about. You witness the objective truth of what happened. But here's where the paradox kicks in. The moment you observe the event, you've fundamentally changed it. Your presence as an observer, however carefully hidden, introduces new variables into the system. The light that bounces off your body and reaches other people's eyes, the air you displace with your breathing, the gravitational effects of your mass, the quantum fields generated by your consciousness. All of these create subtle but real changes to the event you're trying to observe objectively. More disturbing still, your observation might actually determine what happened. In quantum mechanics, the act of observation plays a fundamental role in determining reality. Before measurement, quantum systems exist in superposition states, multiple possible realities existing simultaneously. It's only when observed that these systems collapse into definite states. If consciousness plays a role in this collapse, then your observation of Caesar's assassination might actually determine which of many possible assassination scenarios becomes real. This is the Observer Paradox. The act of trying to observe objective historical truth through time travel makes objective historical truth impossible. Your presence as an observer fundamentally alters the nature of the event you're trying to study, creating a situation where the real version of history can never be known, because the act of trying to know it changes it. But let's dig deeper into the truly unsettling implications of this paradox. If observation determines reality, then what existed before you arrived to observe it? Did the assassination of Caesar have a definite form before you traveled back to witness it? Or did it exist in some kind of superposition of all possible assassination scenarios until your consciousness collapsed it into one specific reality? This suggests that unobserved history might not have definite form at all. Events that no time traveler has ever witnessed might exist in quantum superposition, with all possible versions of those events existing simultaneously until someone travels back to observe them. The past becomes not a fixed record of what happened, but a probabilistic cloud of what might have happened, waiting for consciousness to collapse it into definite form. Consider the implications for our understanding of historical truth. Every event that has ever been witnessed by a time traveler becomes suspect. Not because the time traveler lied about what they saw, but because their observation actually determined what happened. The objective historical record becomes a collection of observer-determined events rather than a record of what actually occurred independent of observation. But this raises an even more disturbing question. If unobserved events exist in superposition until observed, what determines which version becomes real when multiple time travelers observe the same event? If two historians travel back to witness Caesar's assassination and position themselves in different locations, do they see the same event, or does their different perspectives cause different versions of the event to collapse into reality? Maybe the assassination that the first historian observes is slightly different from the assassination that the second historian observes. Maybe Caesar's final words are different. Maybe the number of stab wounds varies. Maybe the exact sequence of events changes depending on the observation angle. Each observer collapses their own version of reality, creating multiple, true versions of the same historical event. This creates a nightmarish situation for historical research. Instead of time travel providing access to objective truth, it fragments truth into multiple observer-dependent realities. Every time traveler who witnesses an event creates their own version of that event. History becomes not a single story, but a collection of observer-dependent narratives, each equally true from the perspective of its observer, but potentially contradictory when compared to other versions. The observer paradox also raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality. If observation by conscious beings determines what becomes real, then consciousness isn't just a passive experiencer of reality. It's an active creator of reality. Your awareness, your attention, your conscious observation doesn't just record what happened. It actually causes what happened to happen in the specific way that it did. This transforms every conscious being into a reality creator rather than just a reality observer. Every time you look at something, pay attention to something, or become aware of something, you're not just observing, you're determining. Your consciousness becomes a cosmic force that shapes the structure of reality itself through the simple act of paying attention. But if consciousness creates reality through observation, what happens when no conscious being is observing? Does reality exist in some kind of liminal state, neither fully real nor fully unreal, waiting for consciousness to give it definite form? This suggests that much of the universe might exist in a quantum superposition state most of the time, only collapsing into definite reality when conscious observers pay attention to it. Consider the implications for our understanding of the present moment. Right now, as you read these words, there are countless events happening around the world that no one is directly observing. Are these events really happening in definite ways, or are they existing in superposition until someone observes them? Does a tree falling in a forest with no one around not just fail to make a sound, but fail to fall in any definite way until observed? The observer paradox suggests that reality might be far more tenuous and observer-dependent than we ever imagined. The solid, objective world we think we inhabit might actually be a constantly shifting landscape of possibilities that only becomes definite when conscious attention collapses it into specific forms. This has disturbing implications for memory and the continuity of experience. If reality is observer-dependent, then your memories of past events might not be records of what actually happened, but rather records of how your consciousness collapsed probability clouds into definite experiences. Your memories become not historical documents, but artifacts of your own reality creation process. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. If observation creates reality, then what happens when you remember observing something? Does the act of remembering re-observe the event, potentially changing it retroactively? When you think back to something you witnessed, are you accessing a record of what happened? Or are you recreating what happened through the act of memory? This suggests that memory might not be passive storage and retrieval, but active reality creation. Every time you remember something, you might be determining what that something was through the act of remembering it. Your past becomes not a fixed history, but a constantly evolving creation of your ongoing memory processes. The observer paradox becomes even more unsettling when you consider its implications for identity and the continuity of self. If your memories are not records, but ongoing reality creation processes, then your sense of continuous identity over time becomes questionable. The person you remember being yesterday might not have existed until you remembered being that person today. Your entire life story becomes not a narrative of things that happened to you, but a constantly evolving creation of your ongoing consciousness. Every act of self-reflection, every moment of remembering your past, every instance of thinking about who you are, potentially recreates your history, rather than just accessing it. This raises the terrifying possibility that you might be constantly rewriting your own existence without realizing it. The person you think you've always been might actually be someone you're creating moment by moment through the ongoing process of self-observation and memory. Your identity becomes not a stable fact, but an active creation of consciousness. The observer paradox also has profound implications for the concept of historical evidence and the reliability of historical sources. If observation determines reality, then every historical document, every archaeological artifact, every piece of evidence from the past becomes suspect. These aren't records of what happened. They're artifacts of how past observers collapsed probability clouds into definite realities. When you read a historical account written by someone who witnessed an event, you're not reading about what objectively happened. You're reading about how that particular observer's consciousness determined what happened through the act of witnessing it. Different observers at the same event would have collapsed different versions of reality, leaving behind different historical records of different versions of the same event. This makes historical research not a process of discovering objective truth about the past, but rather a process of collecting multiple observer-dependent reality creation artifacts. History becomes not a single story, but a collection of consciousness-dependent narratives, each reflecting the reality creation biases of its observers, rather than objective facts about what occurred. But perhaps most disturbing of all is what the observer paradox suggests about the nature of time travel itself. If observation determines reality, then time travel doesn't give you access to the past as it actually was. It gives you the power to determine what the past actually was through the act of observing it. You don't discover history, you create it. Every time traveler becomes not just an observer, but an author, writing the history they think they're reading through the simple act of witnessing it. The past becomes not a fixed record, but a collaborative fiction created by all the time travelers who have ever observed it. Historical truth becomes not discoverable, but creatable. This transforms time travel from a tool for understanding objective reality into a mechanism for imposing subjective reality on the past. Instead of revealing what really happened, time travel allows you to determine what really happened by choosing to observe it in particular ways from particular perspectives with particular expectations and biases. The observer paradox suggests that the dream of time travel as a path to historical truth is fundamentally misguided. There is no objective historical truth to discover because the act of trying to discover it creates it. The past exists not as a fixed record of events, but as a probability space of potential events waiting for consciousness to collapse them into definite form. Consider the implications for the concept of free will and moral responsibility across time. If your observation of past events actually determines what those events were, then you become retroactively responsible for everything you observe in the past. When you witness Caesar's assassination, you don't just see it happen. You make it happen by observing it in the specific way that you do. This creates a form of temporal moral responsibility that extends backwards through time. You become complicit in every historical atrocity you observe, every tragedy you witness, every injustice you see, not because you failed to prevent them, but because your observation actually caused them to happen in the specific way they did. But it also gives you power over the past that extends far beyond traditional concepts of time travel intervention. You don't need to actively change things to alter the past. You just need to observe them with the right kind of consciousness. Your expectations, your beliefs, your mental state at the moment of observation all potentially influence how probability clouds collapse into definite historical realities. The observer paradox ultimately reveals that time travel, if possible, would transform the nature of reality itself from objective and observer independent to subjective and consciousness dependent. It would reveal that the solid, factual past we think we inhabit is actually a fluid, probabilistic space that becomes definite only through the act of conscious observation. The observer paradox stands as perhaps the most metaphysically radical of all time travel paradoxes. It suggests that time travel wouldn't just allow us to visit the past. It would reveal that the past, like quantum reality, doesn't exist in definite form until observed. It would transform us from passive observers of an objective universe into active creators of a subjective reality, where consciousness itself becomes the fundamental force that determines what exists and what doesn't exist across all of time. The paradox forces us to confront whether we want to live in a universe where objective truth exists independently of observation, or whether we're prepared to accept that reality itself might be nothing more than a collaborative creation of consciousness, constantly being written and rewritten by every act of observation, memory, and attention across all of space and time.